My name is Linda Brown. I am 32 years old. Let me set the scene for you. My parents' driveway in Carmel, Indiana, is paved with imported stone. It comfortably holds exactly 4 vehicles. On a humid Sunday afternoon 6 months ago, 3 of those cars were European leased and spotless. The 4th was mine, a 2011 hatchback with a faded silver paint job and a passenger door that groans when you pull the handle. My mother, Patricia, stood next to my driver's side window. She held a glass of iced tea, condensation dripping onto her pristine white tennis shoes. 30 neighborhood barbecue guests mingled on the manicured lawn behind her, eating grilled salmon and keeping their conversations just low enough to hear ours. Patricia dragged her index finger across the hood of my car. Her manicured nail left a clean line in the thin layer of summer dust. "You parked this right up front, Linda," she said, lifting her voice so the couple standing near the rose bushes wouldn't miss a syllable. "It's an eyesore. Does it even run, or did you have it towed here?" I didn't answer. I leaned against my door and looked at her. My younger sister, Jessica, stood a few feet away. She leaned against her own leased luxury SUV, swirling her drink. Jessica wore a designer sundress and a smile reserved for my failures. "I have a $50 bill in my purse if you need gas money to get back to your apartment," Jessica offered. She glanced at her friends gathered near the patio. They chuckled. "It runs fine, Jessica," I said. My voice stayed level. "It is embarrassing," Patricia sighed, shaking her head. "You are 32 years old. You live in a cramped room. You drive a tin can. We invite you to these family events hoping you will look around, gain some ambition, and do something with your life." I crossed my arms. I did not justify my apartment. I did not explain my bank account. I lifted my left wrist and checked my watch. 2:14 p.m. "Are you checking the time because you have somewhere important to be?" Patricia asked, her tone dripping with mock concern. "A shift at the warehouse, maybe?" "No," I replied. "I am just waiting for someone." Before Patricia could deliver her next insult, the heavy hum of an engine turned onto our street. A black town car glided up to the curb, stopping right at the edge of the driveway. The tinted back windows rolled down halfway, then stopped. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out into the thick Indiana heat. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place at a suburban barbecue. He adjusted his tie, pulled a thick gold-embossed leather folder from the passenger seat, and walked straight up the driveway. The chatter on the lawn faded. 30 guests turned their heads to watch the stranger navigate the imported stone. Patricia stepped forward, putting on her neighborhood association smile. "Hello, can I help you? Are you looking for someone?" The man did not look at my mother. He walked right past her extended hand. He stopped directly in front of me. "Ms. Brown," he said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of a downtown boardroom. "Hello, David," I replied. David Sterling was a senior intellectual property attorney. He did not attend Sunday barbecues unless the stakes were in the 8-figure range. He handed me the gold-embossed folder. "The final signatures are secured," David announced, turning his shoulders so his voice carried across the quiet yard. "The international patent has cleared all remaining hurdles. The acquisition team in Detroit finalized the paperwork an hour ago. Your wire transfer is pending. $14 million. Patricia's iced tea slipped from her fingers. The glass hit the driveway, shattering into a dozen pieces. Ice cubes scattered across the stone. Nobody moved. $14 million, Jessica stammered, pushing herself off her SUV. "What patent? What is he talking about, Linda?" Patricia stared at the folder in my hands, the color draining from her cheeks. She looked at David. "Who are you? What patent does she own?" David turned to my mother. He looked at her spilled drink, then at her face. "I am Ms. Brown's corporate counsel," he stated. He pointed a steady finger at my 2011 hatchback. "And that vehicle you were just mocking is not a standard car. It is the operational prototype for a revolutionary automotive battery system. Your daughter designed it. She built it, and she holds the sole rights to it." David paused, letting the reality settle over the lawn. "She didn't come here today for a barbecue, ma'am. She came to celebrate the buyout." The driveway went dead silent. Before I explain how I turned the tables on the family that threw me away, welcome to Grape Vengeance. If you have ever been underestimated by the people who are supposed to love you, please hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment below telling me how old you are and what city you are watching from. I read every single one. To understand how we reached this moment, I need to take you back 12 years. Back to the day I learned exactly what kind of love my family offered. To understand how we reached this moment, I need to take you back 12 years. Back to the day I learned exactly what kind of love my family offered. I was 20 years old and living in my parents' house, not by choice, but because my exit strategy required capital. My daily reality was a local auto parts distribution warehouse on the industrial edge of town. I worked double shifts, 6 days a week. The building smelled perpetually of hot cardboard, hydraulic fluid, and exhaust. My hands carried deep calluses, and machine grease stained the creases of my knuckles. My steel-toed boots were heavy, wearing down at the heels from 14-hour days spent walking concrete floors. I endured the physical toll because I had a singular, sharp focus. I wanted to build things. I had been accepted into an advanced industrial design program. The tuition was steep, but it represented my ticket out of a house where I was treated like a ghost. I tracked my earnings in a small, spiral-bound notebook. I saved every extra dollar living on generic peanut butter and tap water. Over 2 years, I built a balance of $18,000. That sum was my foundation. It covered the program deposit and enough rent to survive the first semester. The money sat in a joint savings account. Patricia had opened it for me when I was a teenager. I never bothered to remove her name. I operated under the naive, foolish assumption that parents do not steal from their own children. It was a Tuesday morning when the illusion shattered. I had just finished a grueling overnight shift. My back ached, my eyes burned, and I wore my stained work uniform as I walked into the local bank branch. I needed a certified check to secure my enrollment. I stepped up to the counter and handed the teller my identification. I asked for the withdrawal. The teller, a woman with graying hair and kind eyes, typed my account number into her terminal. She frowned. She pressed the return key again. She leaned closer to the monitor, her brow furrowing, and then she looked at me with a soft, pitying expression. She printed a receipt and slid it across the counter. The balance line read 0. I remember the physical sensation of the floor dropping away. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. The ambient noise of the bank faded into a dull, rushing static in my ears. My hands shook so badly the thin receipt paper rattled. I asked her to check again. I told her there had to be a routing error. The teller shook her head, her voice full of quiet regret. She turned her screen toward me and pointed to a line item. The entire $18,000 had been withdrawn via an in-person teller transfer 3 days prior. The authorizing signature on the withdrawal slip belonged to Patricia Brown. I drove back to my parents' house in a state of blind shock. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The Indiana summer air felt suffocating heavy with humidity and betrayal. I pulled into the driveway, parked my faded hatchback next to my father's leased sedan, and walked through the front door. The contrast between my reality and theirs hit me instantly. The house smelled of expensive floral water and lemon wood polish. The air conditioning hummed cool and pristine. I found my mother in the kitchen. She stood at the granite island humming a light tune while she arranged imported hydrangeas in a crystal vase. She held a pair of silver pruning shears, trimming leaves with practiced precision. She looked entirely at peace. She did not carry the posture of a thief. I dropped the bank receipt onto the counter. The paper slid across the smooth stone and stopped against the base of her crystal vase. "Where is my money?" I asked. My voice was a ragged, raw whisper. Patricia did not flinch. She did not drop the shears. She leisurely placed a snipped flower into the water, adjusting its angle. She glanced at the receipt, then looked at me with an expression of mild annoyance. She looked at me the way a manager looks at a subordinate who has interrupted an important phone call. "Keep your voice down, Linda," Patricia said, wiping her hands on a linen towel. The funds went to a family priority. I stared at her, struggling to push oxygen into my lungs. That was my tuition, $18,000. I worked nights for 2 years. Where is it? Patricia sighed. It was a long, drawn-out sound of maternal exhaustion. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the edge of the granite island. Jessica's wedding is in 4 months. The deposit for the destination venue in Cabo San Lucas was due on Friday. We needed the liquid capital immediately. The words landed like physical strikes. The casual cruelty in her tone paralyzed me. She had not taken the money to pay a medical bill or save the house from foreclosure. She had taken my future to fund a party. "You stole my education to pay for a vacation?" I said, my chest tightening with every syllable. Thomas walked into the kitchen holding a ceramic coffee mug. He had clearly heard the entire exchange from the hallway. He did not look ashamed. He stepped next to his wife, forming a united front of entitlement. "Do not be dramatic," my father said, his voice flat and authoritative. "Your sister is marrying into a very prominent family. She needs the right start. The optics of this wedding will determine her entire social standing. We cannot have her looking like she comes from nothing." I looked at the man who had raised me, searching for a trace of guilt. There was none. "What about my standing?" I asked. "What about my design program?" Thomas took a slow sip of his coffee. "You do not need $18,000 right now. You are just a warehouse worker, Linda. The design program will be there next year. You can pick up a few more shifts and try again. This family requires sacrifices, and right now, Jessica's future takes precedence." They expected me to scream. They anticipated a loud, tearful outburst. Patricia stood ready to scold my tone, and Thomas stood ready to demand respect. They had conditioned me since childhood to absorb their slights. They believed my self-worth was so low that I would simply accept the theft for the sake of the family image. They wanted me to be the designated workhorse, silently shoveling coal to keep the golden child spotlight burning bright. I did not scream. I did not throw the crystal vase against the wall. I looked at the two people who were supposed to protect me, and I felt the last remaining thread of my familial loyalty snap. The fracture was clean, silent, and permanent. The anger evaporated, leaving behind a profound, icy clarity. I turned my back on them and walked out of the kitchen. I climbed the stairs to my small bedroom. I reached into my closet and pulled out a single canvas duffel bag. I did not pack memories. I left the photo albums, the childhood books, the cheap jewelry they had gifted me over the years. I packed 3 pairs of durable work pants, 5 plain shirts, my spare steel-toed boots, and my design sketchbooks. I walked into the bathroom and grabbed my toothbrush. I checked my wallet. I had exactly $40 in cash. That was my entire net worth. I zipped the duffel bag closed. The sound echoed in the quiet room. I slung the strap over my shoulder and walked back down the stairs. Patricia and Thomas were still in the kitchen. Patricia had returned to trimming her hydrangeas. Thomas was reading the morning news on his tablet. They did not look up when my heavy boots hit the hardwood floor of the entryway. They assumed I was throwing a tantrum. They assumed I would sleep in my car for a night and crawl back by morning, ready to apologize for being difficult. I opened the front door. The thick Indiana heat washed over my face. I stepped onto the porch and pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind me. The latch clicked into place with a solid metallic thud. It was the sound of a vault locking forever. I walked down the driveway, leaving the imported paving stones behind. I got into my faded hatchback, put the key in the ignition, and drove away without checking the rearview mirror. I became entirely invisible to them. I did not call to demand the money back. I did not text to negotiate. I vanished. They got exactly what they wanted, a life focused entirely on Jessica and her pristine optics. They threw me away because they believed I was a disposable asset. They had no idea that walking out that door with $40 in my pocket was the tactical beginning of an empire. The silence they forced upon me became the foundation of my ascent. The warehouse worker they mocked was about to build a technological marvel that would eventually force them to their knees. But survival requires capital, and the night I drove away from Carmel, I had to figure out how to stay alive long enough to make them pay. I drove my faded hatchback straight out of Carmel and onto the highway heading south toward Indianapolis. $40 does not buy a security deposit on a safe apartment. It buys a half tank of gas and a few days of cheap meals. I spent the first 3 nights sleeping in the reclined driver's seat of my car parked under the bright lights of a 24-hour grocery store lot. I kept the doors locked and my canvas duffel bag pulled tight against my chest for warmth. By the 4th morning, I found a job. I walked into an automotive parts distribution warehouse on the industrial edge of the city and asked the floor manager for work. They needed someone to sort heavy inventory on the loading docks. The pay was a single dollar above minimum wage, but they offered overtime. I took every extra shift they posted on the bulletin board. A week later, I rented a room above a commercial laundromat. The space was barely larger than a walk-in closet. It held a mattress on the floor, a single window looking out at a brick alleyway, and a radiator that hissed loudly but rarely produced heat. The floorboards vibrated from 6 in the morning until midnight as the industrial washing machines spun on the ground floor. The air inside my room perpetually smelled like cheap bleach and damp lint. It was not a comfortable home. It was a tactical base. My family assumed I would fail. They thought walking away meant I was throwing an emotional tantrum and that the harsh reality of paying my own bills would break my resolve within a month. They expected a phone call, a tearful apology, and a desperate plea to return to my old bedroom. I never dialed their number. I traded my smartphone for a prepaid model with a limited data plan. I deleted my social media profiles. I erased my digital footprint. I became a ghost. Patricia sent a text message on Thanksgiving 4 months after I left. The notification illuminated my scratched phone screen while I was eating a bowl of rice and beans at my small folding table. Her message read, "We are serving turkey soon. Jessica found a beautiful venue for the reception. I hope you are ready to stop this foolishness and come home." There was no question about my well-being, no concern for where I was sleeping or how I was surviving the approaching winter. It was a calculated taunt. She wanted to remind me of the warmth I was missing. I read the words, pressed delete, and went back to my cold dinner. While my parents were finalizing catering menus and arguing over expensive floral arrangements, I was pouring concrete for a different kind of future. I took my meager warehouse paychecks and enrolled in evening classes at a local technical institute. I studied electrical engineering, focusing specifically on energy storage and hybrid battery systems. My daily routine became a punishing, relentless loop. I woke up at 4 in the morning. I sorted heavy alternators, brake pads, and transmission parts on the concrete loading dock until 4 in the afternoon. I took the city bus to the Technical Institute and sat through dense lectures until 9 at night. Then the actual work began. I rented a 10 by 10 unheated storage unit in a neglected industrial park near the rail yard. It was a corrugated metal box with a single overhead bulb and a roll-up door that rattled fiercely in the wind. During the brutal Indiana winters, the temperature inside that unit dropped well below freezing. I wore 2 pairs of wool socks, thermal layers, and fingerless gloves so I could still manipulate fine copper wiring. I spent my weekend mornings scouring local junkyards. I bought ruined hybrid motors, discarded battery packs, and fried alternators for pennies. I dragged the heavy scrap metal back to my storage unit and tore the components apart. I wanted to understand exactly why these systems failed. More importantly, I wanted to figure out how to capture the kinetic energy these engines wasted during operation. The physical toll was heavy. My hands were perpetually stained with dark grease that no amount of scrubbing could remove. I developed thick calluses on my palms. A dull, constant ache settled at the base of my spine from hunching over a makeshift workbench built out of stacked wooden pallets. My late-night fuel consisted of lukewarm black coffee from a dented thermos and dry crackers. I ignored the biting cold. I ignored the aching muscles. I was chasing a concept. Over 2 grueling years, the concept evolved into a detailed schematic, and the schematic turned into a working theory. I realized that the current regenerative braking systems in modern vehicles were bleeding excess energy as thermal waste. If I could design a modular capture unit, a secondary bridge, Sitting between the braking friction and the primary battery, I could effectively double the efficiency of older hybrid engines. It was a true breakthrough. It was the kind of engineering discovery that corporate research teams spend tens of millions of dollars trying to achieve. I was building it on top of splintered pallets under a flickering light bulb. But having a breakthrough is very different from owning one. I understood the automotive industry. I knew that if I tried to pitch this idea to a major manufacturer without ironclad legal protection, they would steal the design, alter one minor component, and patent the technology themselves. I would be left with nothing. Filing a provisional patent requires serious capital. It requires specialized intellectual property attorneys, steep filing fees, and technical draftsmen. I was still living above a loud laundromat, counting quarters to ensure I could afford bus fare. I did not have the money to hire a lawyer. So I utilized the only weapon I had available: meticulous, undeniable documentation. I went to a discount office supply store and purchased 5 heavy, hardbound accounting ledgers. I chose the specific type where the pages are permanently stitched into the binding, making it impossible to tear a sheet out without leaving obvious evidence of tampering. Every single night before I left the freezing storage unit, I documented my progress. I drew the complex wiring diagrams in thick black ink. I wrote out the mathematical formulas. I detailed my failures, my mechanical adjustments, and my successes. At the bottom of every single page, I wrote the date, the exact time, and my full signature. I took the process one step further. Every Friday during my lunch break, I walked to a small branch bank down the street from the warehouse. I waited in the teller line, presented my state identification, and had the branch manager stamp and notarize the pages I had written that week. The manager thought it was an eccentric hobby. He would smile politely, press his ink stamp to the paper, and hand the book back across the counter. He did not realize he was verifying a legal chain of custody for a technology that would soon disrupt a massive sector of the global automotive market. I was constructing a bulletproof paper trail. If a corporation or a family member ever tried to claim they invented the module, I held hundreds of notarized pages proving I had designed every single circuit years before them. By my 24th birthday, the theoretical design was finished. It was time to build a functional prototype. I had been saving cash in a shoebox for 8 months to fund the next phase. I needed a test vehicle. My faded 2011 hatchback was perfect for the job. It was out of warranty, mechanically simple, and had enough raw space under the hood to mount the secondary capture module. I drove my car into the storage unit and pulled the metal door shut. Over the next several weeks, I spent every spare hour modifying the engine block. I fabricated a durable housing for my module out of scrap aluminum. I rewired the braking sensors, routing the kinetic feedback through my custom bridge before it reached the main battery cell. The work was tedious, frustrating, and exact. I blew 3 main fuses and nearly caused an electrical fire before I successfully dialed in the voltage regulator. Finally, on a rainy Tuesday night in late October, I finished tightening the last mounting bracket. I sat in the driver's seat, my calloused hands resting on the worn steering wheel. The air inside the cabin was damp and cold. I turned the ignition key. The dashboard illuminated. The engine hummed to life. I plugged a digital diagnostic reader into the onboard computer and balanced the small screen on my knee. I put the car in gear and drove out of the dark industrial park. I found an empty stretch of access road running parallel to the freight train tracks. I accelerated to 50 miles per hour, gripped the steering wheel, and firmly pressed the brake pedal. The hatchback slowed down smoothly. It felt like a normal, unremarkable stop. But on the diagnostic screen resting on my lap, the numbers told a breathtaking story. The energy capture metric spiked. It bypassed the standard factory limits, channeling a surge of pure raw voltage directly into the storage bridge. The efficiency readouts were staggering. The module was not just working, it was performing far beyond my initial mathematical projections. I pulled over to the side of the dark road. I put the car in park and stared at the glowing green numbers on the small screen. The rain hit the windshield, blurring the yellow streetlights ahead. I sat alone in a rusty, faded 2011 hatchback, wearing a grease-stained jacket, and realized I had just solved an engineering problem that would change the future of electric vehicles. I possessed a multi-million-dollar technology sitting quietly under the hood of a car that looked like it belonged in a scrapyard. I was hiding an empire in plain sight. I drove back to the laundromat that night with a steady, grounding rhythm in my chest, the kind of calm that arrives when you know the hardest part of the climb is behind you. I possessed the notarized ledgers. I possessed the working prototype. Now, I just needed the financial backing to protect it legally. I thought I was operating in total stealth. I assumed no one in the world knew what I was doing inside that freezing metal box. I believed my isolation was my armor. I was wrong. Someone had been watching me. Someone who knew exactly what the dark grease under my fingernails meant. And the next morning, when I walked onto the warehouse floor to start my shift, that person was waiting for me by the loading dock. The man waiting by the loading dock chain link fence at 6 a.m. was Henry. He was the daytime floor manager at the distribution center. Henry was 68 years old, with shoulders that sloped from 30 years spent working the automotive assembly lines up in Detroit before he retired south to Indiana. He had a gray beard clipped short, steel-toed boots that looked older than I was, and eyes that missed nothing. He carried a thermos of black coffee and stood directly in the path of the time clock. I stopped walking. The morning air was sharp, smelling of diesel exhaust and damp asphalt. My canvas bag hung heavy over my shoulder. I braced myself. I assumed I was fired. "You've been pulling discarded lithium casings out of recycling bin 4, Henry said. His voice was gravel and static. I did not deny it. Denying facts only delays the consequence. Yes. Company policy says scrap belongs to the facility. I know. I gripped the strap of my bag. I will clear out my locker. Henry took a slow sip from his thermos. He did not move out of the way. I drove past the rail yard storage units on Tuesday night. I saw the light spilling under the door of Unit 42. I watched you carry a burnt-out hybrid alternator inside. My pulse hammered a tight rhythm against my ribs. I had spent 2 years operating in the shadows. I had erased my digital footprint. I had severed every tie to my past. And this man had unspooled my routine just by watching the scrap bins. "What are you building in a freezing metal box, Linda?" I looked at him. I weighed the risk. If he reported me to corporate, they might claim ownership of whatever I developed using their discarded scrap. That is how intellectual property theft happens on the factory floor. But Henry did not have a clipboard. He had not called security. He was just a retired Detroit mechanic asking a question. I unzipped my canvas bag. I reached past my work gloves and pulled out one of the hard-bound accounting ledgers. I handed it to him. Henry set his thermos on a wooden pallet. He pulled a pair of scratched reading glasses from his flannel shirt pocket. He opened the ledger to a random page in the middle. I watched his calloused thumb trace the black ink of my wiring diagrams. I watched his eyes scan the mathematical formulas detailing the kinetic energy transfer. He did not scoff. He did not patronize me. He turned the page. He read the notes on thermal waste reduction. He checked the notarized stamp at the bottom corner. He stood there in the freezing morning air for 10 full minutes, reading the architecture of my future. Then he closed the book and handed it back. "The thermal bypass," Henry murmured, his eyes narrowing as he looked at me. "You figured out how to route the friction loss directly back into the primary cell without burning out the voltage regulator." "Yes." "Have you tested it?" "The prototype is under the hood of my hatchback in the employee lot right now. The efficiency metrics exceed the factory limits." Henry stared at me. He looked at my grease-stained jacket. He looked at my worn boots. He understood the scale of the engineering problem I had solved, and he understood exactly how vulnerable I was holding it. "Punch in," Henry said, picking up his thermos. "Don't take any more casings from bin 4. The cameras cover that angle. Use bin 7. It sits in a blind spot." He walked away before I could say thank you. A week passed. I kept my head down. I worked my shifts, rode the bus, and spent my nights freezing in the storage unit. I assumed Henry had simply decided to look the other way. I did not expect him to intervene. I had learned early in life that intervention always carries a hidden price tag. On a Friday afternoon, 10 minutes before my shift ended, the overhead intercom cracked. Henry's voice echoed across the concrete floor, instructing me to come to the manager's office. The office was a cramped square of drywall near the loading bays. It smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Henry sat behind a gray metal desk. He motioned for me to close the door. I shut it. The roar of the forklifts muffled into a low hum. Henry opened his top drawer. He pulled out a plain white envelope and slid it across the metal surface. It stopped inches from my hands. "Open it," he instructed. I reached out and lifted the flap. Inside was a single piece of paper, a cashier's check drawn from a local credit union. I pulled it out and read the numbers printed across the center. $15,000. The air vanished from my lungs. The symmetry of the numbers struck me like a physical blow. $18,000 was the exact amount my mother had stolen from my tuition account to fund a country club wedding. My biological family had drained my foundation to pay for an illusion. Now a stranger, sitting in a dusty warehouse office, was handing the foundation back. I set the check back on the desk. I pushed it toward him. "I cannot take this, Henry. I cannot pay interest on a loan this size." "It is not a loan," Henry replied flatly. "Then what is it? What percentage of the patent do you want?" Henry leaned back in his squeaking chair. He crossed his arms over his flannel shirt. "I spent 3 decades on the assembly line up north. I watched brilliant guys on the floor invent tools, streamline processes, and build better engines. And I watched men in expensive suits walk down from the executive suites, patent those ideas, and take all the credit. The guys who did the actual work got a firm handshake and a frozen turkey at Thanksgiving." He pointed a thick finger at the white envelope. "You hold a disruptive technology, Linda. If you take that prototype to an automotive firm right now, they will drown you in litigation. They will bleed you dry in court until you run out of money, and then they will take your design. You need a provisional patent, and you need a ruthless intellectual property lawyer to build a wall around your work. That check covers the retainer." My vision blurred. I dug my nails into my palms to keep the tears from falling. "Why are you doing this for me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Henry looked at the scuffed surface of his desk. "My wife passed away 4 years ago. We never had kids. The money sits in an account doing nothing. You are sleeping in a room above a laundromat and building the future in a scrapyard. You need the leverage more than I need the interest." "I will draft an equity contract," I insisted. "I will give you 20% of the holding company. Keep your equity," Henry said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "You owe me nothing." I stood there, trying to process a generosity that came with no strings attached. My mother had always taught me that family takes care of family, a phrase she used exclusively to extort my resources. "You are handing me your retirement," I said. Henry offered a faint, fleeting smile. "Family is whoever shows up to help you build. Now take the check and get out of my office. You have a lawyer to hire." 3 days later, I sat in a high-rise office building in downtown Indianapolis. The waiting room featured frosted glass, brushed steel, and leather chairs that cost more than my car. I wore the only clean dress shirt I owned. My boots left faint dust tracks on the polished marble floor. David Sterling did not keep me waiting. He was a senior partner specializing in corporate acquisitions and intellectual property defense. He wore a tailored suit and possessed the clinical, unbothered demeanor of a man who dismantles opposing counsel for sport. Henry had found his name through an old union representative. Sterling was expensive, and he was lethal. I sat across from him at a sprawling mahogany table. I did not waste his time with small talk. I unzipped my canvas bag and placed the 5 hardbound ledgers on the wood. "I have designed a regenerative energy module that doubles the efficiency of standard hybrid battery cells," I stated. "I have a working prototype. I need an airtight provisional patent, and I need an impenetrable corporate structure." Sterling did not smile. He opened the first ledger. He flipped through the pages. His eyes caught the notary stamps at the bottom of each sheet. He checked the dates. He opened the second ledger and did the same. You had a bank manager notarize every single entry, Sterling noted, looking up. Every Friday for 2 years, I confirmed. Sterling closed the book. He folded his hands on the table. The clinical detachment in his eyes shifted into sharp, focused respect. Most engineers bring me a napkin sketch and a dream, Sterling said. You brought me a verified, indisputable chain of custody. No corporate entity on Earth can challenge your timeline. I am not just worried about corporate entities, I told him. I have biological relatives who view my assets as their personal checking account. If they discover my name is attached to a technology of this scale, they will attempt to claim I developed it using family resources while living under their roof. They will try to tie the patent up in civil court. Sterling nodded slowly. He understood parasitic relatives. They were a common variable in estate and corporate law. Then we do not file under Linda Brown, Sterling declared. We establish a blind trust. We layer the corporate entity behind a registered agent. We name the holding company Apex Mobility. The patent will be registered to Apex. All banking, all licensing, and all future acquisitions will route through the trust. If anyone searches public records for your name, they will find 0 assets, 0 real estate, and 0 intellectual property. He pulled a fresh legal pad toward him and uncapped a fountain pen. You will remain a ghost on paper, Ms. Brown. To the outside world, you will still be a warehouse worker. To the patent office, Apex Mobility will be an unassailable fortress. Over the next 6 months, the fortress was built. Sterling filed the provisional patent. He established the trust accounts. The $15,000 from Henry paid for the exact legal armor I needed. I continued working my shifts at the distribution center. I continued living above the loud laundromat. I ate cheap meals and wore the same faded clothes. Nobody in Carmel, Indiana had any idea that the quiet daughter they had discarded was secretly holding the keys to an automotive revolution. But while I was securing generational wealth in total silence, the facade of the Golden family was beginning to crack. The opulent lifestyle Patricia and Thomas had constructed around my sister Jessica required constant funding. Destination weddings leased luxury vehicles, and country club dues do not pay for themselves. They are sustained by a delicate balancing act of debt. And that debt was quietly reaching its breaking point. The people who had stolen my future to fund their optics were running out of other people's money. The bank notices were arriving. The credit limits were exhausted. The wolves were gathering at their manicured front door. They needed a lifeline. They needed a target. And they were about to make the greatest miscalculation of their lives by attempting to hunt the very daughter they had thrown away. 6 months before the barbecue, the careful illusion my parents spent their entire lives protecting began to rot from the inside out. I need to take you inside the house in Carmel to show you how a family goes bankrupt while pretending to be rich. Jessica moved back into my old bedroom that spring. She did not announce a divorce. She framed it as a temporary separation to find herself. She arrived with 4 matched leather suitcases and a leased luxury SUV she could no longer fuel. Her husband, a man who worked in corporate finance, had locked their joint accounts. He filed the paperwork after discovering she had secretly opened 3 separate credit lines in his name to maintain her country club memberships and spa appointments. My sister spent her days sitting by my parents' pristine swimming pool, scrolling through social media, ordering imported clothes on a card our mother paid the minimum balance on. Jessica needed the neighbors to believe her life was an ongoing success story. She attended charity luncheons wearing silk dresses and forced smiles, desperate to hide the panic swimming behind her eyes. Patricia enabled every single delusion. My mother took out a second home equity line of credit just to cover Jessica's car lease and designer habits. She viewed her golden child's image as an extension of her own worth. If the neighborhood found out Jessica was broke and facing a messy divorce, the family standing would suffer a fatal blow. In my mother's mind, debt was a temporary inconvenience. Optics were permanent. But the real crisis was unfolding downtown at my father's regional auto dealership. Thomas Brown built his identity on the foundation of a sprawling car lot. For years, he walked the showroom floor in tailored suits, shaking hands and acting like a titan of local industry. But the automotive market had shifted. Inventory sat stagnant. The polished sedans under the bright showroom lights gathered dust. Thomas was a man who handled stress by ignoring the math. He continued taking his usual salary, continued paying his country club dues, and stopped paying the commercial mortgage on his dealership lot. One Tuesday morning, while I was across the city tightening the mounting brackets on a battery module worth a fortune, my father sat behind his mahogany desk and stared at a certified letter. The bank was done waiting. The notice of default was printed on thick, unforgiving paper. It stated he was 90 days past due on the commercial loan. If he did not produce a substantial cash payment within 4 weeks, the bank would initiate foreclosure proceedings. They would seize the inventory. They would lock the showroom doors. The Thomas Brown dealership would cease to exist. My father drove home early that afternoon. He found Patricia in the kitchen, organizing a stack of unpaid bills. Jessica was outside on a lounge chair, complaining loudly into her phone about a delayed luxury shipment. Thomas dropped the bank notice onto the granite counter. Patricia picked up the paper. Her eyes scanned the bold text. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her face a pale, sickly gray. She set the document down and looked at the man she had married. Thomas explained the grim reality. They were entirely insolvent. The home equity was tapped out to support Jessica. The dealership accounts were overdrawn. They needed a predatory bridge loan to stave off the bank and keep the business afloat, just long enough to find a buyer. To secure a bridge loan of that magnitude, the private lender demanded pristine credit and unencumbered collateral. Thomas possessed neither. His credit score was sinking fast. Patricia was buried under the weight of Jessica's hidden debt. Jessica herself was an active financial liability. They needed a clean name. They needed an untapped credit history. My mother walked over to the kitchen window and looked out at the manicured lawn. She watched her golden child sipping a drink she could not afford. The silence in the kitchen stretched heavy and suffocating. Then Patricia turned around. The panic in her eyes smoothed out, replaced by the cold, calculating focus of a woman searching for a lifeline. She remembered the daughter she threw away. In Patricia's rigid worldview, I was still the invisible, obedient girl who slept in a cramped room and worked manual labor. She calculated my trajectory based entirely on her own prejudice. I had spent 12 years working at an auto parts warehouse. I drove a battered hatchback. I lived in a cheap part of town. Therefore, she assumed I must live far below my means. I likely had a spotless, unused credit history because I had no ambition to buy anything expensive. My mother saw a blank slate. She saw a pristine credit score sitting in the shadows, waiting to be exploited. Thomas argued at first. He reminded her they had not spoken to me in 12 years. He pointed out that I had walked out the door and never looked back. Patricia dismissed his hesitation with a wave of her hand. She operated on the deeply flawed belief that children who are pushed away spend their entire lives desperate for an invitation back to the table. She assumed I was sitting in my cheap apartment lonely and eager to prove my worth to the family that discarded me. She framed the extortion as an act of maternal grace. "We will invite her to a family barbecue," Patricia instructed, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "We will welcome her back with open arms. We show her she belongs here. Once she feels included, we present the loan paperwork. We tell her she is saving her father's legacy. She will be so grateful to be part of this family again, she will sign whatever we put in front of her." Thomas nodded slowly. The desperation eclipsed any lingering guilt. They did not view me as a daughter. I was a financial instrument. I was the emergency ripcord they planned to pull to save themselves from hitting the ground. They had no idea who they were hunting. While Patricia sat at her kitchen island drafting a warm, maternal text message designed to lure me into their trap, I was standing in a windowless storage unit reading a diagnostic output screen. My hands were covered in grease, my cheap boots were scuffed, but the proprietary technology bolted into the engine bay of my rusted car had just drawn the attention of a major corporate acquisition team in Detroit. The contrast was poetic. The family that prioritized optics over substance was drowning in leased luxury and fake wealth. They were clutching designer handbags while their empire burned. Meanwhile, the daughter they mocked for driving a tin can was sitting on a breakthrough that would change an entire industry. I held the keys to generational freedom, hidden beneath the hood of a vehicle they deemed an eyesore. When my prepaid phone vibrated on my makeshift workbench, I did not know the trap was set. I wiped the oil from my fingers and looked at the illuminated screen. The message was from a number I had not saved, but the tone was unmistakable. The predators were reaching out entirely unaware they were knocking on the door of an empire. I had a choice to make. I could ignore the message and remain a ghost, or I could walk directly into their snare and show them exactly what happens when you try to cage a woman who holds all the keys. I was sitting at my small kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, reviewing a technical schematic for the thermal bypass unit, when my phone vibrated against the cheap laminate wood. It was my burner device, the prepaid model I had purchased years ago. Very few people possess that number. I kept it active strictly for logistics related to my storage unit lease. The screen illuminated the dim room. A single notification rested on the glass. A text message from a contact I had not heard from in 48 months. Patricia. My pulse maintained its steady resting rhythm. I did not drop my pen. I simply stared at the illuminated letters forming my mother's name. 4 years of total silence, a void they had engineered, broken on a random weekday in early summer. I unlocked the screen and opened the message. The digital text read like a script drafted by a public relations manager attempting crisis control. Linda, darling, your father and I have been doing so much reflecting lately. We miss our girl. Life is too short to hold on to old misunderstandings. We are hosting a casual family barbecue next Sunday at the house. We want you there. It is time we heal and move forward together. Please come. I read the lines twice. I analyzed the syntax. The word darling felt foreign, a term of endearment she usually reserved for country club acquaintances she secretly disliked. She framed my 12-year exile as an old misunderstanding, effectively erasing her theft of my tuition and her deliberate choice to throw me onto the street. The phrasing removed all accountability. It was a masterpiece of passive deflection. A normal daughter might have felt a surge of hope. A woman desperate for maternal validation might have typed a rapid, tearful reply. I set the device back onto the table. I understood the mechanics of Patricia Brown. My mother never extended an invitation without calculating the return on her investment. If she was reaching across a 4-year divide with fake warmth, she needed something. I did not respond. Instead, I opened my laptop. I navigated to the Hamilton County Public Records database. Working in engineering teaches you to trust data over emotion. Numbers provide a clear, unfiltered picture of reality. I typed my father's business entity into the search bar, Brown Automotive Group. The search engine whirred for a fraction of a second before displaying a cascading list of legal filings. I clicked the most recent documents, the screen filled with the stark, unforgiving language of financial ruin. The county had filed 2 separate tax liens against the commercial property within the last 90 days. Further down the list, I located a formal notice of default registered by a major regional bank. I leaned closer to the monitor, tracing the columns of debt. My father was 3 months behind on the primary commercial mortgage for his dealership lot. The bank was preparing to initiate formal foreclosure proceedings. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the grace period had evaporated. I opened another tab and ran a search on their residential address in Carmel. The results mirrored the dealership's decay. Patricia had extracted a second home equity line of credit, maximizing the leverage on their pristine suburban house. The financial walls were caving in around them. The picture crystallized with cold precision. They were drowning in a self-inflicted ocean of debt, driven by their desperate need to perform wealth for their neighbors and fund Jessica's luxury lifestyle. The bank was circling the dealership. The credit lines were exhausted. They did not want a family reunion. They wanted a life raft. Patricia had deduced that her discarded daughter, the warehouse worker who lived modestly and drove a faded hatchback, likely possessed an unblemished credit history. They needed a pristine signature to secure a predatory bridge loan. They intended to lure me to a backyard grill, feed me a hamburger, offer a hollow smile, and slide a stack of guarantor paperwork across a patio table. They were building a snare, relying on my supposed desperation for their approval. They assumed I would trade my financial future for a seat at their table. The following morning, I took the elevator to the top floor of David Sterling's downtown Indianapolis law firm. The mahogany doors parted, revealing the hushed, carpeted corridors where millions of dollars changed hands in quiet conversations. David sat behind his broad desk reviewing a thick stack of binding contracts. He looked up, his expression shifting into professional focus. "Good morning, Linda," he said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite him. "I was just reviewing the final drafts from Detroit." I took a seat. "Is the timeline holding?" "It is better than holding," David replied, sliding a summary sheet toward me. "The automotive acquisition team concluded their due diligence yesterday. The patent transfer is approved. The holding company structure we built around Apex Mobility functioned flawlessly. They are preparing the wire transfer." I looked at the bold number printed at the bottom of the page, $14 million. "When does it clear?" I asked. "The funds will hit your irrevocable trust next week," David stated. "We finalize the signatures on Sunday afternoon. By Monday morning, you will be one of the wealthiest independent engineers in the Midwest." I folded my hands in my lap. "My mother contacted me last night." David paused. His pen hovered above his notepad. He understood the implications immediately. "Did she ask for money?" "Not yet," I explained. "She invited me to a family barbecue on Sunday, a gesture of healing. I checked the county records this morning. My father's dealership is in active default. They have tax liens stacking up. They need a cosigner for a bridge loan." David's jaw tightened. "They are attempting to leverage your credit before the bank locks the showroom doors." "Yes." "The barbecue is scheduled for Sunday," David noted, checking his calendar. "The exact day our Detroit buyers finalize the acquisition." "The timing is poetic," I murmured. David leaned forward, his tone shifting from legal advisor to protective ally. "Do not attend that gathering, Linda. You have zero obligation to subject yourself to their extortion tactics. We are closing a historic corporate buyout. You do not need the emotional distraction of a suburban ambush. Ignore the message. Let the bank take their dealership." I looked past David out the floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. For 12 years, I had absorbed their disdain. I had accepted my role as the invisible spare part, the disappointment who worked on loading docks, while the golden child glided through life on stolen funds. I had built an empire in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. If I ignored the text message, my parents would simply invent a narrative where I was the cruel, unforgiving daughter who abandoned them in their hour of need. They would spin a story of my heartlessness to their country club friends, forever casting themselves as the tragic victims of my ungrateful nature. I turned my gaze back to my attorney. "I am going to the barbecue, David." He frowned. "That is a strategic error. They are preparing a trap." "I know they are preparing a trap," I replied, my voice steady, devoid of hesitation. "I want to walk into it." David studied my face, searching for a trace of vulnerability. He found a reinforced titanium wall. "I want them to set the stage," I continued. "I want Patricia to gather her audience. I want Thomas to present his loan documents. They need to believe they have cornered the helpless warehouse worker." A slow realization dawned in David's eyes. He understood the architecture of my plan. "You intend to bring the Detroit closing documents to Carmel?" he said quietly. "I want you to bring them, David. I want you to arrive at their house right when they spring the snare." I stood up, adjusting the strap of my canvas bag. "They threw me away because they thought I had no value," I said, walking toward the office door. "I am going to let them spring their trap, and then I am going to show them exactly what they discarded. I am ready to shut the door on them forever, and I intend to do it in front of every neighbor they desperately want to impress." I stepped into the elevator, pulled out my prepaid phone, and typed a single-word reply to Patricia's fake maternal summons. "Yes." 10 days before the scheduled Sunday gathering, the tension in my life shifted from a quiet hum to a direct threat. I sat at my scratched kitchen table running final load simulations on my laptop. My apartment sat off a busy intersection on the east side of Indianapolis. The carpet held stains from 3 previous tenants. The air conditioning unit rattled against the window frame, struggling against the thick summer heat. Patricia assumed this address was proof of my downward spiral. She viewed my modest living conditions as evidence that walking away from the family had ruined me. I knew it was the fortress that kept my work safe. I closed the laptop and walked downstairs to check the mail. The afternoon sun baked the asphalt of the parking lot, sending waves of distortion rising above the pavement. That was when I saw the vehicle. A pristine white luxury SUV sat idling near the dumpsters, taking up 2 parking spaces. The engine purred with quiet, expensive engineering. Jessica stepped out of the driver's seat. She wore a tailored beige blazer and dark sunglasses that shielded her eyes. Her heels clicked a sharp, demanding rhythm against the loose gravel. She did not belong in this zip code. I knew instantly that Patricia had sent her. My mother rarely executed her own reconnaissance when she could send her favorite daughter to do the dirty work. I stayed in the shadows of the concrete stairwell and observed her. Jessica did not walk toward my building entrance to ring the buzzer. She walked straight toward my faded hatchback. She circled the rusted vehicle once, her nose wrinkled in visible disgust. Then she stopped at the driver's side window. She cupped her hands around her face to block the sun glare and pressed her forehead against the glass. I watched my sister pull her phone from her designer handbag. She held the device up to the glass. The camera flash went off twice in rapid succession. She was photographing my dashboard. A standard vehicle features a speedometer, a fuel gauge, and a radio. My car contained a custom digital diagnostic interface, hardwired directly into the center console. Thick bundles of exposed copper wiring ran along the floorboards, routing raw kinetic data from the regenerative braking module to a solid-state drive bolted under the passenger seat. Heavy-duty cooling fans sat exposed near the gear shift. To a trained electrical engineer, the interior was a masterpiece of energy efficiency. To a woman who had never changed her own windshield wipers, it looked like a severe hazard. Or worse, it looked like a crime. I stepped out of the dark stairwell. My boots crunched against the pavement. Jessica jumped, spinning around to face me. She slipped her phone into her blazer pocket, but kept her hand resting firmly over the device. "You have a habit of taking up too much space when you park," I said, keeping my voice level. Jessica recovered her posture within a second. She offered a tight, weaponized smile. "Mom asked me to drop by. We wanted to verify you had the right address for Sunday." She lied with the practiced ease of someone who rarely faced consequences. I did not ask how she found my apartment. Public registries hold residential data for anyone willing to pay a background check service $3. "You could have sent a text message," I replied. Jessica crossed her arms. "I wanted to see how you were living, Linda. Mom told us you were struggling. She failed to mention you were desperate." She pointed a manicured finger at my car window. "What is all that junk inside your vehicle? It looks like you stripped a copper mine. Are you fencing stolen car parts out of this terrible neighborhood?" I looked at her. I did not laugh. I let the humid air stretch the silence between us. "I know Dad needs a cosigner," Jessica stated, dropping the pleasantries entirely. "The bank is threatening to lock the dealership doors next Friday. His credit is ruined. My assets are tied up in my house. You have zero debt and a clean history." She pulled her phone back out of her pocket and tapped the screen. She turned the device around. A clear, high-resolution photo of my proprietary hardware glowed in the sunlight. "You are going to attend the barbecue on Sunday," Jessica commanded. "You are going to sit at the patio table. You are going to sign the guarantor paperwork for the bridge loan." "And if I decline?" I asked. "Then I send these photographs to the Indianapolis police," Jessica warned, her voice dropping into a harsh whisper. "I tell them my estranged sister is running an illegal chop shop out of her rusted car. They impound the vehicle. They tear apart your little operation. You lose whatever shady income you rely on to survive." I stood on the cracked asphalt and studied my younger sister. She thought she held a winning lottery ticket. She believed she possessed the ultimate leverage to force me into financial ruin. She had no idea she had just documented a corporate asset worth $14 million. She had no idea she was threatening a woman who kept a senior intellectual property attorney on retainer. Photographing the interior of private property without consent carries legal risks. Jessica, I stated, my tone devoid of any rising emotion. Using those photographs to extort a financial signature crosses the line into a felony. Jessica scoffed. It was a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed off the brick apartment building. She rolled her eyes behind her dark lenses. Spare me the law and order routine, Linda. You pack boxes at a distribution warehouse. You cannot afford a lawyer. We need that loan approved by Monday morning. You owe Dad for keeping a roof over your head for 20 years. Be at the house on Sunday, or I ruin your life. She turned around and marched back to her vehicle. She climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the heavy door, and sped out of the parking lot without checking for oncoming traffic. I watched her taillights disappear down the busy avenue. The heat radiated from the hood of my car, warming my hands. I did not feel fear. I felt the cold, precise certainty of a reinforced structure holding its ground against a weak storm. Jessica wanted to play a game of leverage. She had just handed me the exact evidence I needed to permanently lock the trap. I pulled my prepaid phone from my pocket. I dialed the downtown number I knew by heart. The line rang twice before the receptionist transferred my call. "David," I said when the attorney answered. "My sister just trespassed on my property and photographed the prototype interior. She threatened to report the hardware to the police unless I sign my father loan documents this weekend." I heard the scratch of a fountain pen across paper on the other end of the line. Did she explicitly state she would use the photos as leverage for a financial signature, David asked. Word for word, I confirmed. David's voice turned clinical and sharp. She has handed us a textbook case of attempted extortion. Furthermore, she photographed proprietary technology that is currently under final review by a major automotive corporation. This changes our entire timeline, Linda. How does it change things? I asked, walking back toward the stairwell. We need to execute an emergency asset protection protocol, David explained. If she takes those photos to the authorities out of spite, we risk a patrol officer impounding your vehicle. If that car goes into a public impound lot, the technology could be compromised, photographed by third parties, or physically damaged. The Detroit buyers would cancel the acquisition instantly. We must build an impenetrable legal fortress around that technology before Friday. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, my boots heavy against the steps. My family thought they were backing a helpless worker into a corner. They were unaware they had just triggered a high-stakes corporate defense strategy. The pieces were moving faster now, and I had to prepare for a Sunday gathering that would shatter their reality forever. The drive to downtown Indianapolis took 20 minutes. I kept the radio off. The air conditioning in my faded hatchback rattled against the dashboard, a familiar mechanical hum that usually settled my nerves. Today, I barely heard it. My mind was running structural diagnostics on my own life, calculating vulnerabilities and reinforcing the weak points. Jessica thought she held a winning hand. She believed a photograph of exposed wiring and a threat involving the police gave her ownership over my decisions. She possessed the typical arrogance of someone who had never faced a real consequence. I did not fear the police. I feared a civil injunction. If my family realized the true nature of the hardware in my car, they would not call local law enforcement. They would call a corporate litigator. I parked in the underground garage of the high-rise and rode the quiet, mirrored elevator to the top floor. David Sterling's office was a sanctuary of calculated silence. The thick glass doors shut out the noise of the city. The carpets absorbed the sound of my boots. I walked past the receptionist, who nodded and gestured toward the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall. David stood by his floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the skyline. He wore a crisp navy suit, his posture rigid and alert. He turned as I entered, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. I sat down. I pulled my prepaid phone from my pocket, unlocked the screen, and placed it flat on the polished wood. "She cornered me in my apartment parking lot," I said, my voice steady. She photographed the interior of my vehicle. The primary diagnostic interface and the cooling housing for the bypass module are visible in the images. She demanded my signature on my father's commercial loan documents. The deadline she gave me is the Sunday barbecue. David picked up the phone. He reviewed the security footage I had captured from the stairwell, watching my sister circle my car. He listened to the audio recording I had triggered the moment I saw her white SUV. The microphone had picked up every word of her extortion attempt clearly. He did not shake his head. He did not offer empty sympathy. He set the phone back down and picked up a silver fountain pen. "Your sister just handed us a profound tactical advantage," David stated. His tone carried the clinical precision of a surgeon reviewing an X-ray. By attaching a specific financial demand to a threat of police action, she crossed the legal threshold into criminal extortion. "We hold the audio evidence, but we are not going to use it yet." "Why not?" I asked. "Because a police report initiates a public record," David explained, leaning forward. "We are operating in the final, most delicate stage of a corporate acquisition. The Detroit buyers are executing their final due diligence. If they see a police report involving the prototype vehicle, it creates an unpredictable variable. Corporations loathe unpredictable variables. They want clean, unencumbered assets." He opened a FIC file on his desk. The tab read, "Apex Mobility." "We received an update from Detroit this morning," David continued. "The engineering team reviewed the final field test data you uploaded last week. The thermal retention numbers exceeded their most optimistic projections. They are no longer waiting for the end of the month. They fast-tracked the acquisition. The board approved the purchase order late last night." I felt the air in the room shift. The abstract concept of wealth I had been working toward for years suddenly crystallized into a rigid, undeniable reality. "The $14 million is sitting in a secure escrow account," David said, his eyes locking onto mine. "It is waiting for one final signature to release the funds. But the threat your family poses requires us to change our defensive posture immediately." I kept my hands still in my lap. "Tell me the exposure." "If your parents discover the financial scale of this technology, they will not stop at extortion," David warned. "They will file a civil suit. They will claim you began developing the underlying theory while living under their roof. They will argue that the $18,000 they took from your joint account was actually seed money they managed on your behalf. They will attempt to establish a retroactive claim to the intellectual property. They do not need to win the lawsuit to hurt you. They only need to file it. A pending civil claim creates a cloud on the patent title. It would freeze the Detroit buyout for years." I thought about my father, standing in his kitchen 12 years ago, telling me I was just a warehouse worker. I thought about my mother pruning her hydrangeas with stolen money. They had spent my entire life minimizing my existence. The idea that they could steal my future a second time sent a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline through my chest. "How do we build the wall higher?" I asked. David offered a tight, lethal smile. "We do not just build a wall, we build a vault. We are moving everything into an irrevocable trust." He pulled a fresh legal pad toward him and began sketching a diagram. "Until now, Apex Mobility has operated under a standard blind trust structure. It provided anonymity, but you still retained direct legal ownership of the entity. We are severing that connection today. I am drafting the documents to transfer the patent rights, the physical prototype, and the receiving bank accounts into the Apex Heritage Irrevocable Trust." He tapped the paper with his pen. "The word irrevocable is your armor. Once you sign the transfer, you legally relinquish personal ownership of the assets to the trust entity itself. You become the primary beneficiary and the managing trustee, but Linda Brown, the individual, will own nothing. If your father tries to sue you for a percentage of your wealth, he will be suing an empty shell. You cannot be forced to surrender assets you do not legally own." "And the timeline?" I asked. "The notarized ledgers you kept," David said, pointing to the canvas bag at my feet. "The ones the bank manager stamped every Friday. Those are the key. We attach certified copies of those ledgers to the trust formation documents. The dates prove undeniably that the intellectual property was developed years after you vacated their residence. It preemptively guts any claim they might fabricate about providing you with resources. I looked at the diagram on his legal pad. It was a masterpiece of legal engineering. It was a fortress designed to withstand a siege built entirely out of paper and ink. I will have the trust documents drafted by tomorrow afternoon, David stated. We will execute the transfer of the patent. Once the asset is secured inside the trust, we can finalize the Detroit acquisition. He checked his calendar, running his finger along the dates. I can have the final corporate buyout papers ready for your signature by Friday. The escrow officer will release the $14 million to the trust account by Friday evening. I sat back in the leather chair. I looked out the window at the Indianapolis skyline. The sun reflected off the glass facades of the surrounding buildings. My family had demanded I attend their Sunday gathering to sign away my credit score. They wanted to humiliate me. They wanted to force me to absorb their debts while they performed their fake prosperity for their neighbors. I turned my attention back to my attorney. Do not schedule the final signing for Friday, I instructed. David paused. He looked at me, a question forming in his eyes. Move the final execution to Sunday afternoon, I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, unyielding register. I want the escrow release triggered on Sunday. I want the wire transfer to clear while I am standing in their backyard. David set his pen down. He studied my face. He understood the industry of leverage, and he recognized the specific gravity of the boundary I was drawing. You are attending the barbecue, he noted. I am attending the barbecue, I confirmed. They built a stage, David. They invited an audience. My mother expects me to arrive looking like a defeated warehouse worker, desperate for a plate of food and a shred of their approval. She expects me to buckle under the pressure of their peers. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the mahogany edge of his desk. I will not sign the Detroit documents in this office. I want you to bring the final portfolio to Carmel. I want you to walk up their imported stone driveway right when my father pushes his loan papers across the patio table. I want the final transaction to happen in front of every person they invited. David did not argue. He did not advise caution. He recognized that this was no longer just a corporate transaction. It was a reckoning 12 years in the making. I will prepare the final portfolio in a presentation binder, David agreed. I will monitor the escrow release from my mobile terminal. When the funds clear the Federal Reserve routing protocols, I will arrive at the address. I stood up from the leather chair. The heavy weight of the last 2 weeks, the anxiety of Jessica's trespassing, the pressure of the impending foreclosure, all of it evaporated. I felt incredibly light. I possessed a clear, unburdened focus. I left the law firm and drove back to my apartment above the laundromat. The industrial washing machines vibrated the floorboards a familiar, comforting rhythm. I spent the evening ironing a simple pair of dark slacks and a plain gray button-down shirt. I polished my work boots. I did not purchase a new outfit. I did not buy an expensive watch. I curated my appearance to reflect the exact level of struggle my family anticipated. I wanted to give them the precise image they required to inflate their arrogance to its maximum capacity. I placed the ironed clothes on a hanger. I packed my hardbound ledgers into a secure, fireproof safe hidden in the back of my closet. I walked to the small window and looked out at the brick alleyway. For 12 years, I had survived in the margins. I had eaten cheap meals, endured freezing winters in a storage unit, and swallowed the silent grief of being discarded. My parents thought they were summoning a ghost to pay their ransom. They had no idea they were inviting a phantom millionaire to sit at their table. The trap was fully set, and I was ready to let them spring it on themselves. The drive north up US 31 took 40 minutes. My faded 2011 hatchback rattled when I pushed it past 60. The air conditioning had quit working 2 summers ago. I rolled the windows down and let the thick Indiana heat fill the cabin. I wore dark slacks and a plain gray shirt. I did not buy a new dress. I did not wear jewelry. I dressed exactly how they expected a struggling warehouse worker to dress. I gave them the canvas they needed to paint their masterpiece of condescension. I turned onto their street in Carmel. The neighborhood was quiet, shaded by old oak trees and bordered by manicured hedges. I found my parents' address. The driveway was paved with imported stone. 3 leased luxury vehicles sat parked in a neat row. I pulled my hatchback right up behind Jessica's pristine white SUV. I turned the key. The engine shuddered and died. I stepped out into the humidity. The backyard gate was open. The smell of grilled salmon and expensive cedarwood smoke drifted over the fence. I heard the low murmur of 30 voices, the clink of ice in crystal glasses, the soft jazz playing from hidden outdoor speakers. I walked through the gate. The lawn looked like a country club spread. Thomas had invited his remaining business associates, the men he desperately needed to impress. Patricia had invited her socialite circle. The women wore sundresses and held wine glasses by the stem. The men wore linen shirts and expensive loafers. Patricia spotted me first. She did not miss a beat. She broke away from a conversation with 2 neighbors and marched straight toward me. She wore a floral silk dress and held a glass of iced tea. She did not lower her voice. She raised it. She wanted the audience. "Linda!" Patricia called out. Her voice carried over the jazz music. "You actually made it, and you drove that thing all the way here." She pointed her manicured finger toward the driveway. Several guests turned their heads. Conversations paused. "I wasn't sure it would make it up the hill," Patricia continued, offering a tight, performative smile to the woman standing nearest to us. "It is an eyesore, sweetheart. Does it even run properly, or did you have to push it the last mile?" I looked at my mother. I noticed the tight lines around her mouth, the forced brightness in her eyes. The bank foreclosure was breathing down her neck, yet she prioritized mocking my transportation to secure her social standing. "It runs fine," I replied. My tone stayed level. I did not cross my arms. I let my hands rest at my sides. "It is embarrassing," Patricia sighed. She shook her head, putting on her best display of maternal pity. "You are 32 years old. You live in a tiny room. You drive a tin can. We invite you to these gatherings hoping you will look around, gain some ambition, and finally do something with your life." A few of the business associates chuckled. The sound was soft but clear. I absorbed the laughter. I filed it away. Thomas stepped out from the patio covering. He carried a pair of grilling tongs, playing the role of the relaxed host, but his face told a different story. His skin was pale. A sheen of sweat coated his forehead that had nothing to do with the summer heat. He handed the tongs to a caterer and walked toward me. "Let us not dwell on the negative, Patricia," Thomas said, projecting a booming, benevolent tone. "Linda is here. That is what counts." He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. His grip was tight, painful even. He steered me away from the center of the yard, guiding me toward a wrought iron patio table situated near the back fence. He wanted me away from the direct earshot of his investors, but still visible enough to maintain control of the scene. "Sit down," Thomas instructed. The benevolent host vanished the moment we were out of immediate earshot. I took a seat on the iron chair. Thomas pulled a manila folder from inside his jacket. He dropped it flat onto the glass table. He opened the cover. Inside sat a stack of commercial loan documents. The top page featured the letterhead of a predatory private lending firm. "I'm going to get straight to the point," Thomas said. He leaned his knuckles on the glass looming over me. "The dealership hit a rough patch. The market shifted. We need a bridge loan to carry the inventory through the next quarter. The lender requires a clean signature, a guarantor." I looked at the paperwork. "You want me to co-sign a commercial loan?" "I am giving you a chance to earn your place back in this family," Thomas corrected. He pushed a silver pen across the table. It rolled and stopped against my hand. "You vanished for 12 years. You contributed nothing. Family takes care of family, Linda. You owe me for putting a roof over your head for 2 decades. Sign the bottom line on page 4. I picked up the pen. I felt the cool metal against my fingers. I looked at the loan amount. It was staggering, a figure that would bankrupt a normal person 10 times over. "I am not signing this, Thomas," I said. I set the pen down. My father's face darkened. The veins in his neck surfaced. He slammed his hand flat against the table. The glass rattled. "You will sign it," he ordered. His voice spiked in volume, breaking the unspoken rule of suburban restraint. The jazz music seemed to quiet down. Heads turned. Patricia stopped swirling her iced tea. The guests stared at the patio table. Thomas had lost his composure. The panic of his impending ruin was bleeding through his tailored shirt. "You have a clean credit history because you live like a peasant," Thomas hissed, leaning closer. "You sit in a warehouse packing boxes. You have no assets. You have no future. The least you can do is secure mine." I met his gaze. I did not flinch. "I am not your financial savior. You threw me out over $18,000. I will not absorb your debt. If you walk away from this table, you are done," Thomas threatened. The desperation made his voice shake. "You will never step foot in this house again." Before I could formulate my response, high heels clicked sharply against the patio stone. Jessica arrived. She wore a designer sundress. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves. She stepped next to our father, holding her smartphone in her right hand, like a loaded weapon. She looked down at me with pure, unfiltered disdain. "Do not play hard to get, Linda," Jessica sneered. "We already know you do not have a choice." She tapped her phone screen and tossed the device onto the table, right on top of the loan documents. I looked at the bright screen. It displayed the high-resolution photograph she had taken in my apartment parking lot 10 days ago. The image showed the interior of my faded hatchback. The custom digital diagnostic interface glowed on the dashboard. The thick bundles of exposed copper wiring snaked along the floorboards. The heavy-duty cooling fan sat exposed near the gear shift. "I did some asking around," Jessica stated. She crossed her arms. "Normal cars do not look like a server room. Those are commercial-grade components. You work at an auto parts distribution center. It does not take a genius to figure out you are stealing hardware from your employer to build whatever shady side hustle you are running out of that junker." I looked from the phone to my sister. She was beaming. She genuinely believed she had uncovered a petty theft ring. She thought the patented proprietary thermal bypass module bolted into my chassis was a collection of stolen warehouse scraps. "Sign Dad's paperwork," Jessica commanded. Her voice carried the sharp ring of victory. "Sign the loan, and I will delete the photos. Refuse, and I email these pictures to the regional manager of your distribution center. I will forward them to the local police. They will impound your car. They will tear apart your little operation. You will lose your minimum wage job, and you will face theft charges." She rested her hands on the table, leaning into my space. "You do not have the leverage here. Pick up the pen." I sat in the wrought iron chair and absorbed the sheer magnitude of their delusion. Thomas believed my value was limited to a 3-digit credit score. Jessica believed my life's work was a felony waiting to happen. Patricia stood a few feet away, watching with a satisfied smirk, trusting her golden child to close the trap. They had cornered me in front of 30 witnesses. They had laid out their demands, issued their threats, and demanded my submission. They waited for the tears. They waited for the panic. They expected the invisible, discarded daughter to break. I did not break. I did not argue. I did not attempt to explain the engineering marvel sitting in their driveway. I slowly lifted my left wrist. I looked at the face of my watch. 2:14 p.m. The air hung heavy and thick. The smell of cedar smoke drifted past the table. "What are you looking at?" Thomas demanded. His patience had evaporated. "Pick up the pen." I lowered my wrist. I looked past my father, past my sister, and focused my attention on the street beyond the open driveway gate. The low, powerful hum of a heavy engine turned onto the pavement. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the neighborhood. It was a smooth, expensive purr that did not belong to a standard sedan. A black town car glided into view. It rolled up to the curb, stopping precisely at the edge of the imported stone driveway, boxing in my faded hatchback. The tinted back windows rolled down halfway. The engine idled. Thomas frowned, turning his head toward the street. Jessica picked up her phone. her confident smirk faltering into an expression of mild confusion. The driver's side door of the town car opened. A polished leather shoe stepped out onto the pavement. The timing was flawless. The stage was set, the audience was captive, the extortion was documented. I rested my hands in my lap and waited for the man in the charcoal suit to walk up the driveway and dismantle my family's entire existence. The black town car sat at the edge of the driveway, its engine idling with a steady, deep hum. The vehicle did not fit the aesthetic of a suburban weekend gathering. It was sleek, imposing, and clearly dispatched from a downtown corporate fleet. I remained seated at the wrought iron patio table. My hands rested in my lap. I did not look at the loan guarantor documents my father had shoved in front of me. I watched the tinted windows of the town car. My father frowned. He loosened his grip on the patio chair. He despised variables he could not control, and an uninvited car idling in his driveway was a variable. The jazz music playing from the hidden outdoor speakers seemed to drop in volume. The low chatter of the 30 guests gathered on the manicured lawn began to fade. People stopped eating their grilled salmon. They lowered their crystal glasses. They turned their heads toward the street. The driver's side door opened. A polished leather shoe stepped onto the imported paving stones. David Sterling emerged into the thick Indiana heat. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that commanded immediate authority. His tie was perfectly knotted. His posture was rigid and alert. He pulled a thick, gold-embossed leather folder from the passenger seat and pushed the car door shut. The heavy thud of the door closing echoed across the quiet yard. He turned and began walking up the driveway. David did not rush. He moved with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who dictates the terms of every room he enters. His leather shoes clicked sharply against the stone. He scanned the backyard, taking in the caterers, the floral arrangements, and the tense posture of my family members. Thomas stepped away from the patio table. He carried his metal grilling tongs in his right hand. He plastered his customary salesman smile across his face, attempting to reclaim control of his territory. He assumed David was a lost executive, or perhaps a wealthy neighbor from the gated community down the road. "Can I help you find someone?" my father asked. He projected his voice, aiming for a tone of benevolent hospitality. David did not slow his stride. He did not return the smile. He looked right past my father, as if Thomas were an empty chair on the lawn. He walked past my mother, who stood near the rose bushes. Patricia lowered her iced tea, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. Her curated social event was going off script. He walked past my sister. Jessica took a half step back against her least luxury SUV, her confident sneer faltering. David bypassed all of them and stopped directly in front of the wrought iron table where I sat. He held out the gold-embossed folder. I reached up and took it. The leather felt smooth and heavy. It was the physical manifestation of 12 years of silent, agonizing labor. "Good afternoon, Ms. Brown," David said. His voice was crisp, lacking any trace of suburban warmth. It carried easily across the silent yard, reaching the ears of every investor and socialite present. I apologize for the interruption. The Detroit legal team finalized their review faster than we anticipated. I opened the folder. The top page featured a banking wire confirmation. The routing numbers were printed in bold black ink. "The acquisition is complete," David announced. He adjusted his stance, angling his shoulders so his voice projected toward my parents. "The $14 million buyout has cleared escrow. The funds are currently resting securely in your irrevocable trust." The backyard froze. The silence became a heavy, physical weight pressing down on the lawn. The metal tongs slipped from my father's hand. They hit the paving stones with a harsh, clattering crash. He did not bend down to pick them up. His jaw went slack. He stared at the folder in my hands, his eyes darting between the leather cover and the tailored suit David wore. Patricia stood paralyzed near the garden. Her hand trembled. Her glass of iced tea tilted sharply to the right. A splash of cold amber liquid spilled over the rim and soaked into her pristine white tennis shoes. She did not notice the stain. She did not blink. Jessica seemed to shrink. The arrogant posture she had carried her entire life dissolved. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her face a pale, sickly gray. She looked at her smartphone resting on the patio table, the device containing the blackmail photographs of my dashboard. 10 minutes ago, she believed that phone held the power to destroy my life. Now it looked like a child toy resting next to a corporate bank transfer. David turned his attention to my mother. He subjected her to a cold, assessing gaze. "Mrs. Brown," David said evenly, "I overheard your comments regarding your daughter's vehicle when I pulled up to the curb." Patricia opened her mouth. Her lips moved, but her throat produced no sound. She clutched her dress, searching for a polite response that did not exist. "I want to clarify a point of fact for you," David continued. He pointed a steady finger toward the end of the driveway directly at my battered 2011 hatchback. That vehicle is not a junk car. It is not an embarrassment. It houses the Apex Regenerative Braking Module. It serves as the operational prototype for a proprietary energy system. He let the engineering terms hang in the humid air, forcing my mother to absorb her own ignorance. Then he addressed the rest of the yard, ensuring my father business associates heard every single word. "Your daughter designed the module. She built the prototype with her own hands. She holds the sole patent rights to the technology." David looked back at Patricia. She is the majority shareholder of Apex Mobility, the firm the Detroit Automotive Group just purchased for $14 million. He paused, letting the reality settle over the manicured grass. "She did not come here today for a barbecue, ma'am," David stated, delivering the final blow. "She came to celebrate the buyout." The truth hit my family with staggering force. You could see the cognitive dissonance fracturing their minds in real time. The narrative they had built and maintained for 12 years shattered. I was not the failure they had discarded. I was not the invisible spare part. I was not the desperate warehouse worker they had lured to a patio table to extort for a bridge loan. I was a self-made millionaire sitting in front of a stack of their past-due debt. My father looked at the commercial loan documents resting on the glass table. The papers he had shoved toward me, demanding my signature to save his sinking dealership, sat inches away from a confirmed $14 million wire transfer. The contrast was devastating. He had tried to force a queen to pay a peasant ransom. The silence among the guests finally broke. A low ripple of whispers swept across the lawn. A man in a linen shirt turned to his wife, his eyebrows raised in shock. One of my father's business partners pulled out his phone, likely running a quick search for Apex Mobility. The local socialites exchanged wide-eyed glances. My parents had invited these people to witness their prosperity. They had curated this audience to maintain their status. Instead, they had provided front-row seats to their own financial and moral ruin. The guests had watched Thomas try to bully his daughter into co-signing a loan. They had heard Jessica threaten to call the police over dashboard wiring. They had seen Patricia mock a vehicle that contained a fortune. Their carefully guarded illusion of the perfect wealthy family evaporated into the summer air. They were exposed as insolvent, manipulative, and entirely ignorant of their own daughter brilliance. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I sat in the wrought iron chair and closed the gold-embossed folder. The transaction was complete. The armor was sealed. My wealth was walled off in a trust they could never touch, protected by years of dated ledger books and ironclad legal structuring. I had walked into their trap willingly, and I had watched the steel jaws snap shut on their own hands. I looked at my sister. She was staring at her phone, realizing the profound legal peril she had invited upon herself. She had trespassed and photographed patented proprietary corporate hardware. She had attempted criminal extortion. Her threat was no longer a sibling rivalry tactic. It was a severe liability. I looked at my father. The sweat on his forehead had doubled. He was breathing heavily, his mind scrambling to find a way out of his impending foreclosure now that his designated scapegoat had transformed into an untouchable titan. Then I looked at my mother. The shock was beginning to recede from her features. The pale dread in her cheeks was shifting. I knew her patterns better than anyone. I knew that people who worship status do not apologize when they are proven wrong. They recalculate. They adjust their tactics to survive the new math. Patricia stepped over the shattered glass of her dropped iced tea. She did not look at the mess on the stones. She locked her eyes on the leather folder resting in my lap. The cruel, mocking tone she had used moments earlier vanished, replaced by a sudden, suffocating warmth. She was preparing to pivot. She was preparing to claim my silent victory as a family triumph, operating under the delusion that blood entitled her to a share of my empire. The silence in the backyard held a specific weight. It was the kind of quiet that follows a car crash right before the alarms start blaring. David Sterling stood next to my wrought iron chair. He did not fidget. He did not look away. He let the reality of $14 million settle over the imported paving stones. 30 guests held their breath. I watched my mother. I had spent 32 years studying Patricia Brown, learning her moods the way a sailor studies a changing sky. I knew how she handled losing. But this was not a simple loss. This was a public exposure of her insolvency, paired instantly with the revelation of my wealth. Her brain had to process two competing realities. The dealership was sinking, and the daughter she threw away held the life raft. The physical transformation took about 4 seconds. First, the color returned to her cheeks. Then, the rigid panic in her posture melted away, replaced by a fluid, practiced ease. She smoothed the front of her floral silk dress. She stepped right over the shattered glass of her dropped iced tea. She did not look at the mess. She locked her eyes onto me. The mocking edge, the sharp condescension she had wielded just moments before, vanished. A warm, suffocating smile stretched across her face. It did not reach her eyes, but it was bright enough to blind anyone who did not know her. Linda Patricia breathed out. The word floated through the humid Indiana air, dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my stomach turn. She stepped forward, throwing her arms wide. "Oh, my brilliant girl. I always knew you had it in you." She reached me, attempting to pull me into an embrace. I did not stand up. I kept my back straight against the iron chair. She settled for gripping my shoulders, her manicured nails pressing into my gray shirt. She turned her head toward the audience on the lawn, the business associates, the neighbors, the country club friends, who were still staring with open mouths. "Did you hear that, Patricia?" called out to them, her voice ringing with manufactured maternal pride. "My daughter, a pioneer in the automotive industry. She built a regenerative battery module from scratch. She spoke the engineering terms flawlessly, parroting David's exact phrasing as if she had nurtured my career from the beginning." She looked back down at me, her eyes shining with fake tears. "We pushed you so hard 12 years ago because we saw your potential, sweetheart. We knew you needed to find your own way to build your grit. And look at what you achieved. I am so incredibly proud of you." I sat perfectly still. I listened to the woman who had stolen my $18,000 tuition fund frame my 12-year exile as a calculated parenting strategy. She was rewriting history in real time. She needed the audience to believe this was a triumphant family reunion, not a failed extortion attempt. Patricia looked back up at Thomas. Her smile widened, tight and desperate. "Thomas, do you see? Our troubles are over. We do not need the bank anymore. Linda is here." Thomas Brown shook off his paralysis. The color returned to his face, replacing the pale dread of impending foreclosure. He dropped his metal grilling tongs onto a side table. He smoothed his polo shirt and walked toward me. The authoritarian patriarch who had shoved a stack of loan documents in my face 5 minutes ago was gone. He adopted the persona of a practical, sensible businessman, preparing to close a lucrative deal. He stopped beside David Sterling, pointedly ignoring the attorney, and reached his hand down toward the gold-embossed leather folder resting in my lap. "Let me see the term sheet, Linda," Thomas said. His tone was casual, expectant. He genuinely believed he had the right to inspect my corporate acquisition. I slid the folder to the left, out of his reach. My hand rested flat on the leather cover. His fingers grasped empty air. He withdrew his hand, letting out a short, breathy chuckle to save face in front of the watching guests. "All right, keep it close to the vest." "I respect that," Thomas said. He pulled up a chair and sat across from me, leaning his elbows on the glass table, pushing his own predatory loan documents to the side as if they were old newspapers. 14 million, he mused, testing the syllables on his tongue. That is an exceptional valuation. You played your cards well. He folded his hands. Here is how we handle this. The dealership needs an immediate injection of capital to clear the default notices. It is a minor cash flow issue. We use a small fraction of your buyout to satisfy the commercial mortgage. $1 million, maybe $1.5 million tops. It clears the ledger, stops the bank, and saves the family legacy. He mapped out the spending of my trust fund with staggering confidence. Then we address Jessica's lease arrears and clear out your mother's equity lines. We stabilize the household. This is exactly what we needed, Linda. The timing could not be more perfect. I looked at my father. He did not ask how I built the technology. He did not ask about the countless nights I spent tearing apart alternators in a freezing storage unit. He did not inquire about my physical well-being. He jumped straight to the arithmetic of his own salvation. In his mind, my wealth was family wealth. And because he was the head of the family, my assets automatically belonged under his jurisdiction. While Thomas outlined his financial rescue plan, I watched Jessica out of the corner of my eye. My younger sister had retreated toward the patio edge. She stood near a potted fern, staring at the screen of her smartphone. The confident sneer she had worn all afternoon had evaporated. 10 minutes ago, she believed the photographs of my dashboard gave her supreme authority over my life. Now she understood she had been holding a lit match next to a powder keg. I saw her thumb moving rapidly across her screen. She was deleting the pictures. She was scrubbing the evidence of her trespassing, terrified that David Sterling would hand her a lawsuit before the barbecue ended. She slipped the phone into her designer handbag and took a hesitant step toward the iron table. Jessica looked at the gold folder, then at me. The golden child, drowning in credit card debt and a failing marriage, was suddenly looking at the warehouse worker for a lifeline. "Linda," Jessica started, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "That automotive company in Detroit, Apex Mobility, if they bought your patent, they're going to need executive staff to manage the transition, right?" She stepped closer, offering a fragile, nervous smile. "You know my background. I have years of experience in high-level marketing. I know how to manage corporate branding. I could step in as your vice president of marketing. We could run the transition together, sisters building an empire." She reached out and touched the edge of the glass table. "I can help you navigate this level of wealth. You are going to need someone you trust watching your back." I sat in the wrought iron chair and looked at the three of them. Patricia with her hands clasped in fake joy, Thomas already spending $1 million in his head, Jessica begging for an executive title to save her from her own financial ruin. I waited for one of them to say the words. I waited for my mother to say she was sorry for taking my tuition money. I waited for my father to say he regretted telling me I was just a warehouse worker. I waited for my sister to apologize for threatening to call the police on me. The apologies never came. They did not express a single ounce of remorse for the past 12 years. They did not acknowledge the profound cruelty of the loan documents still sitting on the table. They skipped the accountability entirely and leaped straight to the entitlement. The silence stretched between us thick with their expectations. They looked at me with hungry, waiting eyes, entirely convinced that their sudden warmth would erase a decade of ice. They had proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that their love was a transaction. It was a currency, exchanged only when the return on investment was favorable. I picked up the gold-embossed folder. I felt the weight of the thick paper inside. I looked at the neighborhood guests who were still watching our table with morbid fascination. The stage was set exactly as I had planned. The predators had shown their teeth, and now they were wagging their tails, begging for a scrap from the table they had banished me from. I took a slow breath, preparing to deliver the response I had earned the right to give. Patricia stepped forward, extending her arms wide. Her floral dress rustled in the thick summer air. She aimed for a maternal embrace, a physical claim on my new reality. She wanted the audience to see a mother welcoming her lost child. She wanted the narrative to reflect a sudden, joyful reunion. I took one deliberate step back. My boots scraped against the imported paving stone. The distance between us remained open and cold. Her arms hovered in the humid air for a long moment before dropping to her sides. "I am not your financial savior," I said. My voice carried across the silent yard. It reached the catering staff near the grill. It reached the business associates standing by the rose bushes. It reached the neighbors holding their crystal glasses. I did not raise my pitch. I did not yell. Facts do not require volume to inflict damage. Patricia blinked, the fake warmth slipping from her face. "Linda, honey, we are your family. We just want to celebrate you. We want to bring you back into the fold." I looked at the wrought iron patio table behind her. The stack of commercial loan documents sat exactly where my father had shoved them. The top page fluttered slightly in the afternoon breeze. "You did not invite a daughter to dinner today, Patricia," I stated, meeting her eyes. "You invited a credit score." Thomas stepped closer, his face turning a dark shade of plum. The sweat pooled at his temples and soaked into the collar of his expensive shirt. His authority was unraveling in front of his investors. He needed to stop the hemorrhage. "Shut your mouth," Linda Thomas ordered. It was a harsh, desperate whisper meant only for me. "You are embarrassing us in front of our guests. We can discuss this inside." I held up my left hand, a simple, flat palm facing his chest. The gesture stopped him in his tracks. "You built this stage," I told him. "You gathered this audience to corner me. Now we are going to finish the performance." I turned my attention back to the guests, ensuring my voice remained clear and steady. The clinical checkmate had begun, and I intended to audit our entire history. 12 years ago, I came into your kitchen, holding a bank receipt showing a zero balance," I said. I had worked overnight shifts on a concrete loading dock. I had sorted auto parts for 2 years to save $18,000 for my industrial design program tuition. Whispers rippled through the guests. A woman in a linen sundress placed a hand over her mouth. One of my father's business partners narrowed his eyes and crossed his arms. "You stood in your pristine kitchen," I continued, keeping my focus locked on my mother. "You admitted you took every single dollar of my savings. You legally drained my joint account to pay for a destination wedding deposit in Cabo San Lucas." Patricia looked at the grass. She clasped her hands together tightly. "We needed the funds," she stammered, abandoning the proud mother script to defend her past theft. Jessica was marrying into a prominent family. We had to maintain our standards. The optics were important. I shifted my gaze to Thomas. "And you stood right next to her. You told me I was just a warehouse worker. You told me I had to absorb the theft because Jessica's social standing was a family priority. You told me I could pick up extra shifts and try again next year." Thomas opened his mouth to argue, his face flushed with mounting panic. I did not give him the space to interject. "You told me 12 years ago that I was not part of this family if I did not sacrifice my future for it," I said. I let the words hang over the lawn. "I accepted your terms. I walked out your front door with $40 in my pocket. I honored the boundary you set. For a dozen years, you honored it too. You never called. You never checked if I had food or shelter. You maintained total silence until the bank threatened to seize your car lot and lock your showroom doors." The business associates staring at Thomas began to step back. They physically widened the circle around him. His financial desperation was now public record. His moral bankruptcy was laid bare for his peers to evaluate. A man who steals his own daughter's tuition to fund a party is not a man you trust with a commercial investment. I turned to Jessica. She remained frozen near her leased luxury SUV. She held her designer handbag tight against her stomach, her knuckles white. She looked like a woman who had just realized the ground beneath her feet was composed entirely of thin ice. I walked toward her, stopping 3 feet away. 10 days ago, I said, addressing my sister. You tracked down my apartment building. You trespassed in my parking lot. You peered into the window of my vehicle. You took photographs of my dashboard without my consent. Jessica swallowed hard. Her eyes darted toward David Sterling, the attorney, standing watch near the idling town car. She understood the profound legal peril she had invited upon herself. Extortion is an ugly reality, and describing the mechanics of it out loud strips away any suburban polish. You confronted me on the asphalt, I stated. You mocked the exposed copper wires. You called my hardware a shady side hustle. You threatened to send those photographs to my warehouse manager. You threatened to call the Indianapolis police and have my car impounded unless I agreed to co-sign Dad's commercial loan. The guests were no longer whispering. The silence was absolute. I pointed to David Sterling. The attorney standing in this driveway just finalized a $14 million acquisition based entirely on the hardware you photographed. The shady wiring you threatened to expose just bought me financial freedom for the rest of my life. Jessica looked down at her expensive sandals. She had nothing to say. Her ultimate leverage was a mirage. The photographs she intended to use to destroy me had actually captured the operational prototype of an industry-disrupting technology. Thomas tried one last tactical maneuver. He tried to invoke duty, relying on the old patriarchal structures he had used to dominate our household. You grew up under my roof, Linda Thomas said, his voice straining for authority. I fed you. I clothed you. You have a duty to help us now. Family takes care of family. Providing basic necessities to a child is the minimum legal requirement of a parent, I replied. It does not generate an invoice. It does not create a debt I am forced to repay. I looked at the 3 of them standing in their manicured backyard. The golden child, drowning in hidden credit card debt. The patriarch, losing his business to foreclosure. The matriarch, who valued image over substance, now facing the total destruction of her social currency. The money from Detroit sits in a fortified, irrevocable trust, I explained, maintaining my clinical tone. The trust structure protects the assets from frivolous claims, external liabilities, and predatory relatives. I let my eyes sweep across their pale faces, ensuring they understood the finality of my decree. Not a single cent of that trust will ever touch a debt you created, I declared. I will not pay your commercial mortgage. I will not fund Jessica's lease arrears. I will not pay off the home equity lines you drained. I will not save this house. Patricia let out a sharp sob. It sounded genuine this time. The realization of her impending poverty was crashing through her denial. The country club luncheons were over. The European cars would be repossessed. You cannot do this to us, Patricia cried out, tears streaking her makeup. Where will we go? What will we do? We will lose everything. You will do exactly what I did 12 years ago, I said. You will figure it out without a safety net. I stepped away from the wrought iron table. The loan documents fluttered, again useless sheets of paper, demanding a signature they would never receive. The air in the backyard felt lighter, crisp, and clean. I had walked into their snare and dismantled it, piece by piece, leaving them trapped in the precise cage they had designed for me. The rejection hung over the patio, clear and undeniable. My father stood near the wrought iron table, the silence pressing against him from every corner of the yard. For a man who had spent his entire adult life dictating the terms of every relationship, the word no was a foreign language. He could not process my refusal. He could not comprehend that the financial lifeboat he needed was sailing away, piloted by the daughter he had treated like a discarded receipt. I watched the transformation take hold of him. The forced, benevolent smile he had worn for the last 10 minutes cracked and fell away. The warm, patriarch routine dissolved, leaving behind the raw, unpolished panic of a failing businessman. The skin around his collar flushed a deep, bruised purple. His chest heaved, pulling the fabric of his tailored shirt tight. He realized his charm held zero currency. He saw the cold boundary I had drawn, and his entitlement curdled into sheer fury. He did not attack me directly. Men like Thomas Brown rarely confront women who hold their ground. Instead, he sought a target he believed he could intimidate. He turned his attention away from me and locked his eyes onto David Sterling. My father took 2 heavy steps toward the attorney. He raised his right hand, pointing a thick, trembling finger at David's chest. "You think you are walking out of here with my family wealth?" Thomas shouted. His voice echoed off the manicured hedges, harsh and desperate. "You think you can stroll into my backyard, hand my daughter a folder, and steal what belongs to this house?" David did not take a step back. He stood near the idling town car, his posture relaxed, his expression reflecting mild academic interest. "I am not stealing anything, Mr. Brown," David replied quietly. "I am finalizing a corporate acquisition that has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," my father bellowed. The veneer of suburban grace was entirely gone. He was performing for his investors now, trying to project strength while standing on a collapsing foundation. "She is my daughter. She lived under my roof. Every mechanical skill she possesses, every design concept she generated, started when she was eating my food and sleeping in my house." Tomas leaned forward, his face slick with sweat in the humid Indiana heat. "We funded her foundation. We provided the environment that allowed her to learn. If she built a proprietary battery module, this family owns a piece of the intellectual property. You hear me. We are entitled to a percentage of that $14 million. I sat back in my chair and observed the sheer audacity of his claim. 12 years ago, he had stood in his kitchen and told me I was a warehouse worker who required sacrifice. He had watched me pack a single duffel bag and walk out the door with $40 in my pocket. He had offered 0 shelter, 0 food, and 0 guidance for over a decade. Yet here he stood, attempting to claim jurisdiction over the calluses on my hands and the late nights I had spent freezing in a rented storage unit. "If you try to move those funds into an independent trust, I will file an injunction tomorrow morning," Thomas threatened, spit flying from his lips. "I will hire the best litigation firm in Indianapolis. We will tie that patent up in civil court for a decade. I will freeze your corporate buyout. I will drag this out until those Detroit buyers walk away and your little holding company bleeds to death in legal fees." The threat hovered in the air. A few of the neighborhood guests gasped. Patricia took a step toward her husband, her hands fluttering near her chest, terrified by the escalating confrontation, but unwilling to stop him. Jessica retreated further behind her leased SUV, sensing the danger of a man fighting a battle he did not understand. My father puffed out his chest, believing he had delivered the ultimate checkmate. He thought he had introduced a variable we had not prepared for. He assumed the mere threat of a protracted lawsuit would force us to the negotiating table. David Sterling looked at the pointing finger. He looked at the purple flush on my father's neck. Then he reached down and unclasped the brass zipper of his leather portfolio. The sound of the zipper parting was sharp and metallic. "Mr. Brown," David began, his voice dipping into a calm, surgical register. "I strongly advise you to lower your hand and listen very carefully to the reality of your situation." David extracted a thick stack of papers bound with a heavy binder clip. He stepped toward the patio table and placed the documents on the glass right next to the predatory loan forms my father had tried to force upon me. "You are not going to file an injunction," David stated. "You are not going to tie this patent up in court, and you are certainly not going to claim a single fraction of a percent of Ms. Brown's intellectual property." Thomas scoffed a wet, ragged sound. "You cannot stop me from filing a claim." "I do not need to stop you," David replied smoothly. "The paper trail will stop you." David flipped open the top page of his stack. It revealed a high-resolution photocopy of a hardbound accounting ledger. The black ink wiring diagrams and mathematical formulas were clearly visible. At the bottom of the page, a prominent notary stamp sat next to a signature and a date. "Ms. Brown anticipated your exact strategy years ago," the attorney explained. "While she was developing this technology in an unheated industrial storage unit, she maintained meticulous build logs. Every schematic, Every failed prototype, every theoretical breakthrough was recorded in bound ledgers. David turned another page, revealing a second notary stamp. Every Friday for 2 years, she walked into a certified bank branch and had her progress notarized by a branch manager. David continued, "We possess a verified, unassailable chain of custody. The timestamps prove beyond any shadow of legal doubt that the primary theories and the physical execution of the bypass module occurred long after she vacated your residence." My father stared at the photocopied ledgers. His breathing grew shallow. Furthermore, David said, adjusting his cuffs, the patent is currently held within an irrevocable trust. Ms. Brown does not legally own the intellectual property as an individual. You cannot sue a beneficiary for assets residing inside a protected corporate entity. If you attempt to file a claim claiming familial entitlement, a judge will dismiss it with prejudice during the preliminary hearing. Thomas gripped the edge of the glass table. The knuckles on his hands turned bone white. The bluster was failing. The grand threat of a decade-long lawsuit was disintegrating against a wall of dated, notarized evidence. "I will find a judge who will listen," Thomas rasped, though his voice lacked conviction. "I will claim she stole the initial seed money from us before she left. I will invent a reason. I will make it messy." David went perfectly still. The polite professional demeanor he had maintained evaporated. The senior litigator surfaced, cold and unyielding. "If you file a frivolous lawsuit against my client," David warned, his tone dropping to a whisper that somehow carried across the entire yard, "you trigger the discovery process. And discovery, Mr. Brown, works in both directions." My father froze. "If you initiate a civil claim, my firm will issue immediate subpoenas for your financial records," David stated. "We will request full transparency regarding the accounting practices of the Brown Automotive Group. We will pull the county tax ledgers. We will examine the 3 months of unpaid commercial mortgages. We will audit the 2 active tax liens filed against your property." Patricia let out a strangled sob, covering her mouth with both hands. David did not break eye contact with my father. "We will subpoena the applications for the home equity lines of credit your wife extracted. We will depose the private lenders holding those fraudulent bridge loan documents currently resting on this table. We will place your impending bankruptcy, your insolvency, and your desperate attempts at financial extortion into the public record." The air left my father's lungs in a sudden sharp hiss. "You will not just lose a civil suit," David concluded, delivering the final, fatal blow. "You will invite a forensic audit that will likely result in criminal fraud charges regarding your dealership operations. You will be indicted before the first deposition is even scheduled." The backyard was a tomb. The business associates my father had invited, the men he needed to impress to save his sinking car lot, heard every single word. They heard the attorney mention tax liens. They heard the words impending bankruptcy. They heard the exposure of a man who had built a house of cards and tried to use his daughter to pay the mortgage. One of the local investors, a man wearing a linen shirt, quietly set his drink on a side table and turned toward the driveway gate. 2 others followed. They were stepping away from a sinking ship, abandoning a toxic asset in real time. Thomas stood paralyzed next to the patio table. His arms hung limply at his sides. His chest rose and fell in erratic, panicked jerks. He looked at the photocopied ledgers. He looked at the loan documents he had tried to force me to sign. He looked at the guests filtering out of his yard without saying goodbye. He realized the profound, inescapable depth of his miscalculation. He had plotted an ambush against a vulnerable warehouse worker. He had brought a knife to a gunfight against a woman who had spent 12 years building an empire in the dark. I watched the fight drain out of his eyes. The tyrannical father who had dictated my worth, who had stolen my tuition, and who had ordered me to leave his home, simply folded inward. He had nothing left to say. The extortion was dead. The legal threat was dismantled. The social illusion was shattered. I sat in my chair, feeling the cool Indiana breeze brush against my face. The narrative was over. The silence that followed was not the quiet of a tense standoff. It was the quiet of a war that had just been definitively won. The patio sat in a strange, thick quiet. It was the kind of quiet that follows a car crash right before the sirens start. The business associate in the linen shirt, the one who had set his drink down moments ago, was the first to cross the grass. He did not walk toward Thomas to shake his hand or offer a polite excuse. He walked straight to the side gate. His wife followed closely behind him, keeping her eyes fixed on the imported paving stones. That single departure broke the invisible dam. The rest of the audience began to move. It was not a chaotic rush. It was a polite, coordinated retreat. The socialite friends Patricia had spent decades courting suddenly found urgent reasons to check their watches. They murmured soft excuses about traffic and early Monday mornings. They left their plates of grilled salmon half-touched on the wrought iron tables. The ice in their crystal glasses melted into lukewarm water. Patricia tried to stop the hemorrhage. She smoothed the front of her floral silk dress and took a step toward a woman she had co-chaired the spring gala with for 5 years. She offered a tight, desperate smile and reached out a hand. The woman offered a brief nod in return, sidestepped my mother, and walked out the gate without saying a single word. The social standing my mother had meticulously built, brick by brick, dissolved right there on the lawn. Within 15 minutes, the backyard was empty of everyone except the catering staff. The caterers worked in total silence, packing away the expensive chafing dishes and folding the linen tablecloths with practiced speed. They had witnessed the undeniable extortion attempt, and they wanted to leave the premises just as badly as the investors did. Thomas stood near the grill. He watched the last of his business lifelines drive away. He did not try to call them back. He knew the arithmetic of his own ruin. He had gambled his reputation on a desperate scheme, and the public exposure had stripped him of his only remaining currency. The fallout did not take months to arrive. It took exactly 3 weeks. A bank does not operate on emotion, apologies, or family drama. A bank operates on ledgers and deadlines. Without the bridge loan my father had tried to force me to co-sign, the regional lender executed the final notice of default. The grace period expired on a Tuesday morning. I did not drive past the dealership to see it happen. I heard about it from David Sterling, who kept a quiet eye on the public county filings. The bank sent representatives to the commercial lot. They locked the showroom doors and placed heavy chain links through the front gates. The Thomas Brown Automotive Group ceased to exist. The inventory of unsold cars was seized and cataloged for auction. The illuminated sign that had stood over the highway for 2 decades was powered down. My father lost his business, his daily routine, and the very foundation of his identity. He had spent his life walking across that showroom floor, wearing tailored suits and projecting authority. Now he was a man without an office, waking up every morning in a heavily leveraged suburban house he could no longer afford to maintain. He had to face the reality that his empire had collapsed not because of a shifting economy, but because he had tried to fund it with stolen tuition money and a shattered relationship with his own daughter. The financial rot spread to Jessica with equal speed. She had built her entire persona around the illusion of effortless wealth. She wore designer sundresses and drove a leased luxury SUV to charity luncheons funded entirely by credit cards and my mother's drained home equity lines. When Thomas lost the dealership, the cash flow that sustained Jessica's performance evaporated. Her creditors stopped sending polite letters and started taking action. On a Thursday afternoon, a tow truck backed into the driveway of the Carmel house. The operator checked the vehicle identification number on Jessica's pristine white SUV, attached the steel winch, and lifted the front wheels off the pavement. Jessica stood on the front porch and watched it happen. She could not stop the repossession. She did not have the funds to cover the arrears. The car she had leaned against while mockingly offering me $50 for gas money was towed down the street, leaving an empty space on the stone driveway. Stripped of her vehicle and drowning in consumer debt, Jessica had no choice but to move her remaining designer luggage permanently into her childhood bedroom. The walls of that house became a pressure cooker. 3 people, all accustomed to living large, were suddenly trapped together in a sinking structure, blaming each other for the water rising around their ankles. The local community in Carmel operates on a strict code of respectability. People forgive bad investments. They do not forgive public extortion and fraud. The story of the backyard barbecue moved through the neighborhood with ruthless efficiency. The details of Thomas trying to force his daughter to sign loan documents and Jessica threatening to call the police over dashboard wiring became the primary topic of conversation at the local country club. Patricia felt the freeze immediately. She attended the monthly library board meeting expecting her usual seat at the head of the table. Instead, the other members greeted her with tight, formal smiles and kept the conversation strictly to the printed agenda. When the meeting adjourned, no one invited her for coffee. The invitations to summer galas and private dinner parties simply stopped arriving in her mailbox. She walked through the high-end grocery store and noticed women she had known for 20 years suddenly turning down different aisles to avoid making eye contact. The family became a cautionary tale. They were no longer the prominent Browns of Carmel. They were the people who had tried to steal from their own child and destroyed themselves in the process. Patricia tried to fix it the only way she knew how. She tried to rewrite the narrative. During the 4th week after the barbecue, my prepaid phone registered an incoming call from her number. I did not answer. The device automatically routed the call to a blocked folder I had set up months ago. Over the next 10 days, she left 7 voicemails. I sat in my home office one evening, watching the sun set over the Indianapolis skyline, and listened to the audio transcripts. Her tone shifted with every message. The first was light, attempting to sound casual, suggesting we grab lunch and put the past behind us. The third voicemail featured tears. She wept into the receiver, begging for a second chance, pleading with me to remember the good times we had shared when I was little. The final message was steeped in pure desperation. She talked about the bank taking the dealership, about Jessica losing her car, about the suffocating tension inside their house. She begged me to call her back, claiming that families should stick together during hard times. She never once said the word sorry. She never apologized for stealing my savings or throwing me out. She just wanted access to the financial lifeline she had tried to sever 12 years ago. I deleted the transcripts and cleared the blocked folder. I did not feel a surge of vindictive joy. Revenge requires you to actively participate in someone else's destruction. I had not destroyed my family. I had simply stepped out of the way and allowed the natural consequences of their own choices to run their course. They had built a house out of greed, manipulation, and conditional love. When the wind blew, the structure collapsed precisely because it lacked a solid foundation. They were left to sit in the wreckage of their own making. I turned away from the phone and looked at the clean, quiet space of my office. I had protected my work, secured my future, and drawn a boundary they could never cross again. The silence in my apartment was no longer heavy or isolating. It was the sound of true, undeniable peace. 6 months have passed since that Sunday afternoon in Carmel. I am sitting in a corner office on the top floor of a glass building in downtown Indianapolis. The desk in front of me is cut from a solid slab of walnut. The chair is ergonomic, designed to support a spine that spent years bending over scrap metal and loading dock pallets. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I can see the highway stretching north toward the industrial sectors of the city. The environment has changed, but my routine remains remarkably stubborn. I still wake up at 5 in the morning. I still brew my coffee using the cheapest generic store brand I can find, drinking it black from a ceramic mug I brought from my old apartment. The anxiety of survival is gone, replaced by the steady, quiet hum of a machine running exactly as it was designed to. Apex Mobility is no longer just a blind trust holding a single patent. We are in the final stages of integrating my thermal bypass module into the new fleet of commercial delivery vehicles rolling off the assembly lines in Detroit. My days are filled with engineering reviews, supply chain logistics, and material sourcing meetings. I wear tailored slacks now instead of grease-stained work pants, but I still keep a set of steel-toed boots under my desk. I refuse to be an executive who forgets what the factory floor feels like. I review the final production timeline for the Detroit contract. The numbers line up perfectly. The efficiency metrics from the field tests mirror the exact formulas I wrote in those notarized ledgers years ago. I sign my name at the bottom of the approval document. The ink dries dark and permanent. I close the file, pick up my jacket, and head for the elevator. My designated parking spot is in the secured underground garage right next to the spots reserved for the senior partners of David Sterling's law firm. Sitting in that premium concrete rectangle is my 2011 hatchback. I kept the car. I never repainted the faded silver exterior. The passenger door still groans slightly when you pull the handle. To anyone walking past, it looks like a vehicle that took a wrong turn and ended up in the executive tier. But under the hood, the rusted components are gone. I spent 2 months working with a specialized fabrication team to strip the original internal combustion engine and replace it with a pristine, state-of-the-art electric powertrain. The proprietary regenerative module sits securely in the chassis, feeding power back into the system with flawless precision. I slide into the driver's seat. I press the ignition button. There is no engine shudder, no rattling fan belt. The dashboard illuminates, and the car hums to life with a near-silent electric whisper. I drive out of the garage and merge onto the evening gridlock. I do not head north toward Carmel. I do not drive past my father's foreclosed car dealership or the house my mother desperately tries to hold on to. I head east, navigating away from the polished suburbs and into a quiet, working-class neighborhood shaded by old maple trees. I pull up to a modest, ranch-style house with a neat front lawn and a wooden porch. The gutters are clean, the driveway is freshly swept, and the porch light clicks on as the sun begins to dip below the horizon. Henry is sitting in a rocking chair near the front door. He wears a faded denim jacket and holds a newspaper. He watches my silver hatchback pull up to the curb. He recognizes the shape of the car, but he tilts his head as I glide up the driveway without a single sound from the engine. I step out into the cool evening air. "You fixed the exhaust," Henry notes, his voice carrying the same gravel texture I remember from the loading dock. "I retrofitted the entire block," I reply, walking up the front steps. "It runs on the new system now, all electric." He nods, setting his newspaper on a small side table. He looks at my tailored clothes, taking in the shift in my circumstances. "You look well, Linda. The corner office suits you." I sit in the empty wooden chair beside him. The neighborhood is peaceful. A dog barks a few streets over. A neighbor waters a row of hydrangeas across the road. This is what safety feels like. No performances, no hidden agendas, just a front porch and the fading daylight. I reach into my jacket pocket and pull out a thick, sealed white envelope. I place it on the small table next to his newspaper. Henry looks at the envelope. He does not reach for it. He looks back at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We had an agreement," he says. "I told you I did not want equity. I gave you that check because you needed the leverage, not because I needed a payout." "I know what you said," I reply, keeping my tone steady, "and I respected your terms during the acquisition phase. I did not give you shares in the holding company. I did not put you on the board." I tap the paper. "But that check you handed me in the warehouse office was your retirement savings, Henry. You risked your own security to make sure a girl you barely knew did not get crushed by the people who were supposed to protect her." Henry crosses his arms. "I get by fine on my pension." I lean forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Inside that envelope is a certified bank draft. It returns your initial $15,000. The rest of the sum attached to it represents a standard venture capital return on a high-risk, early-stage investment. It is enough to pay off your mortgage, handle your property taxes for the rest of your life, and ensure you never have to check a price tag at the grocery store again. He stares at the white paper. His jaw tightens. He spent his whole life working assembly lines, conditioned to believe that money only flows upward, never back down to the floor. "Take the envelope, Henry," I tell him gently. "It is not charity. It is a dividend. You earned it the day you stopped me by the chain-link fence and treated me like an engineer instead of a scrap scavenger." He reaches out slowly. His thick, calloused fingers pick up the envelope. He breaks the seal and slides the bank draft out far enough to read the numbers printed across the center. He stops breathing for a long second. He slides the check back inside and folds the flap down. He looks out at the street, his eyes shining in the dim porch light. He clears his throat twice before he speaks. "I have some cold beers in the fridge," he says, his voice thick. "I would love a beer." He stands up, walks into the house, and returns a minute later with 2 glass bottles. He hands me one. Condensation drips down the cold glass, chilling my fingers. He sits back down in his rocking chair. We tap the bottles together. The glass clinks a sharp, clean sound in the quiet evening. We sit on the porch and drink in silence. I watch the streetlights flicker on down the block. I think about the journey that brought me to this specific chair. I think about my mother standing in her pristine kitchen, arranging flowers with stolen tuition money. I think about my father shoving commercial loan documents across a patio table, demanding my signature to save his ego. I think about Jessica trespassing in my parking lot, holding her phone like a weapon. For 12 years, I believed I was the broken piece in their machine. I believed my worth was tied to my ability to endure their disregard. I thought setting a boundary meant declaring war. It took a storage unit, a pile of discarded alternators, and a ruthless corporate attorney to teach me the truth. A boundary is not an act of aggression. It is an act of preservation. I did not destroy my family. I simply stopped providing the structural support for their delusions. When I stepped out of their foundation, gravity did the rest. My parents are currently navigating a reality they spent decades trying to avoid. They lost the dealership. They lost the social standing they valued above my presence. They are learning how to live in a world where actions carry strict, unyielding consequences. I do not revel in their downfall. I do not track their location or check their social media. I wish them no harm, but I grant them no access. Family is not a bloodline. Blood is just biology. Family is the person who hands you a check when you are sleeping above a laundromat. Family is the lawyer who stands in a driveway and dismantles an extortion attempt. Family is the quiet space you build for yourself where no one is allowed to ask you to shrink. Henry takes a slow sip of his beer. He rests the bottle on the arm of his chair. "You did good, kid," he says softly. "You built a real fortress." I take a drink from my own bottle. The cold liquid cuts through the residual heat of the day. "I had good architects," I reply. The sky turns a deep indigo blue. The stars begin to surface above the silhouettes of the maple trees. I lean back against the wooden slats of the porch chair. The air feels clear. My lungs expand without resistance. I am 32 years old, and I am entirely free. You don't have to absorb someone else's failures to earn your place at the table. Build your own table and choose who gets a seat.